Chapter 327. That's all, Senior Maynold. Maynold chuckled, but her expression quickly turned serious. You need to be careful. That brat is starting to get restless again. But this time, they're quite secretive. I can't find anything on them yet. Freya raised her head and looked at her worriedly. Don't worry, the black-haired knight took a deep breath. I'm here. Just be careful. With that, she raised her head and looked at the direction where the carriage disappeared to. The sky in the north was gloomy, as if a terrible storm was brewing. But would this storm come before the end of winter? No one knew. Maynold only knew that everyone in the academy was beginning to panic. This last piece of land in the kingdom might not be a safe haven, but the center of a huge whirlpool in the future. As for this temporary peace, it was just the illusion of the calm before the storm. At the very least, the knight knew that in the north, in the free port of Ampere Seal, a war without smoke was about to begin. She turned her head and looked deeply at Freya. Can you do it? She asked. What? Freya was stunned. The future Valkyrie's dazed look amused Maynold. She covered her mouth slightly and replied with amusement, nothing. In the last few days of the month of frost, everything seemed to converge together. When the situation in the north was on the verge of collapse, time also flew by. In the blink of an eye, 2 weeks had passed in the Schaflund mines. The incident that caused everyone to panic turned out to be a farce. This farce was spread widely in the town at first, but it was quickly forgotten. People were always forgetful. Apart from the families of the injured and the deceased who would forever remember this day, most people returned to their original trajectory of life after just a short week. On the surface, the Schaflund mine seemed to be unchanged, maintaining the same old appearance as it had for decades. But under the surface, some things were slowly changing. First, Coden's movements were restricted after Brando and the others left the mines. Under Brendel's instructions, the old man announced that he would temporarily hand over all his duties in the mines to Perkins, and shut himself in to recuperate. As for the cowardly clerk, he had completely surrendered when Brendel and Medisa barged into his office. Now that Janna and more than 20 peak iron-ranked mercenaries had disguised themselves and were monitoring the clerk 24 hours a day, he wouldn't dare to play any tricks even if he was given 100,000 guts. In fact, it was the opposite of what Brando expected. Perkins seemed to be more cautious and diligent than before, to the point that even his own subordinates who did not know the truth praised him. Were praises. Those deputies probably thought that their boss had finally repented and turned over a new leaf after shouldering all the work in the mining area, and had become pragmatic and willing to work. Even the spies sent by Count Randner to monitor Brendel's performance in secret had given him good reviews for the past 2 weeks. Of course, all of these reports went through Brando's hands. When Brando showed these reports to the cowardly clerk, Perkins cursed out loud for the first time. Of course, after cursing out loud, he looked around cautiously, as if he was afraid that his disrespect towards Count Randner would be heard by the spies and the surroundings. This is the so-called mud that cannot support a wall. Brendel shook his head involuntarily. But in order to appease the cowardly clerk, Brando promised him that he would not reveal the details of his work to anyone. He would only say that he was going to imprison him and find someone similar to him to replace him. Even though this lie seemed to be easily exposed, it at least gave the clerk some psychological comfort. Now that he was constantly living in fear, he could only rely on this little bit of comfort to live. As for Coden, he was sent to Abes the next day. When the old man saw the county, he knew that he could not escape. However, he still rejected Brando's goodwill and asked him to keep his promise and let him go when the time was up. Brendel shook his head with a smile when he saw the report. He was sitting at a table in a certain room in the Forest Trout Inn in Schaflund. Coden was obviously related to his grandfather, but the old swordsman did not mention a word about it after they left the underground. The young man intended to find out the truth of the secret from the other party, but he was not in a hurry. After all, he had plenty of ways to do it. Compared to that, he had more pressing matters to attend to. So he put this matter aside and turned back to look at the back of the merchant girl who was buried in a large pile of books. After leaving the underground, he had scolded this disobedient young lady. Originally, he thought that Roman would ignore him for a few days, but when he left the mine, this young girl who claimed to be a great merchant still held his hand tightly. It was as if she was holding an important treasure and was afraid of losing it if she wasn't careful. Brando regretted it a little and felt that he was too harsh with his words. But he did not expect that in just a few hours, the merchant girl would return to her old ways and swagger around. When the Nightsong Tiger arrived and Brando ordered Yuta to make a copy of the books, the young Roman finally calmed down. She had been working for 2 days, and her progress was unbelievably fast. She seemed to have an innate talent in this aspect. She could easily distinguish what she wanted from the complicated numbers and abbreviations. It was a good thing that Vaughn's accounting system was rather simple, and was still in a very primitive stage. Roman quickly investigated Perkins and the others' deficits, and checked out the loopholes in the accounts one by one. However, Brando knew that it was not the time to make a bold move in the mine. At least in name, the mine was still under Count Randner's jurisdiction. He and the Roman could not enter the mine and meet with Yuta as they wished to avoid attracting the attention of the spies in the mine. In fact, the 20 or so mercenaries that Count Randner placed in Randner's camp used the excuse of needing to replenish the casualties from the mining accident. These mercenaries would not be needed for too long, and Count Randner would not allow too many unfamiliar faces to appear in his territory. It would take at most a month for the new mercenaries to be replenished. Of course, Brando could still obstruct them, but it would take at most 2 months. 2 months was more than enough for Brando. Thus, he put this matter aside and waited to settle the score in the future. But other than this important matter, there were also other small matters that gave him a headache. For example, the young men who came out from the underground with them, Cohen, Joka, and Mar. Brando admired the thin young man, or rather, the future king of Randner. Regardless of what Brando knew or saw, this young man was definitely not willing to be an ordinary person. In fact, this thin young man's performance in the underground also proved this point. But what surprised Brando was that Cohen rejected his invitation. The young man clearly stated that he and his friends would leave this place and go to the outside world according to their original plan. This news made Brando feel that it was a pity. King Randner was not an ordinary person, but he also knew that he could not force them to stay. He could only let them stay in Schaflund for the time being, and wait for 2 months before deciding whether to stay or leave. On the other hand, Brando did not manage to keep the people who were supposed to stay. The people who were not supposed to stay were left behind. The strange old dwarf claimed to be the only descendant of the Rune dwarves, and his performance in the underground world seemed to prove this point. Of course, this was not a big deal. What really made Brando feel strange was that this old dwarf seemed to have appeared in front of him for the past few days. Of course, the bad-tempered old dwarf didn't seem to treat him well, but at least he wasn't as cold as before. But for this reason, Brando still kept Halran Gaia. He was originally worried that this was the old dwarf's goal, but he did not expect that the old dwarf was still the same as before. It was as if he was not affected at all. Brando could only attribute this to the old dwarf's mental illness, and then turned his head to ignore him. Because a few days later, another more important matter completely diverted his attention. The Nightsong Tiger and his men arrived at the mine. They were thinking of ways to secretly transport all the silver ores stored in Schaflund's warehouse, smelted them, and sent them to ABs to be used as currency. At the same time, the Nightsong Tiger brought good news to Brando. In fact, on the 3rd day after they left, the Shire found Grodden's private mint in a nearby manor. But there was a small interlude. When the noble's private soldiers hiding in the manor realized that their whereabouts were exposed, they immediately closed the door and did not allow the mercenaries to enter. They even clamored to fight until the last man. This action obviously angered the leader of a small mercenary group that joined Brando's side. The leader was called Madron, and compared to his strength, he was more famous for his fiery temper. That was why he wanted to teach these mercenaries a lesson. Since they wanted to resist to the last person, then he would fulfill their wish. But just when this barrel of gunpowder was about to go head-on, our young wizard vetoed his request. Charles only sent a message to Madeline, "Wait and see." This sentence had a miraculous effect. On the second day, the arrogant private soldiers of the nobles raised the white flag and opened the door to surrender dejectedly. Although the mercenaries present at the time felt that this sorcerer was mysterious and unfathomable. But soon, they realized that it was not a big deal. The reason was simple. By this time, news of Sir Maxon's defeat had already spread throughout Tonagel. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheedian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 328. Let's turn our attention to Paydarson. The core of Randner Province was located at the border between Randner Province, Orec, and Frauda. Originally, it was to prevent the Highlanders from invading the north, but as the kingdom's rule over the south gradually stabilized, it became the center of political symbolism. Currently, Randner's largest fortress was Fort Balasar, but Count Randner still preferred to place his administrative center in Paydarson. Paydarson Castle had a history of nearly 130 years. Its style originated from the revival of the Elven style during the Year of the Return of Glory, and it could be said to be one of the few surviving works of art from that era. It was also one of the proudest places of the Randner family. It symbolized the respect this family had for tradition, and this respect earned them a relatively high reputation among the nobles. Of course, this also complemented Count Randner's good reputation among the nobles of Aween for being a two-faced person. Just like the veteran gatekeeper, who had been guarding the gate of the castle for most of his life, but since the November War, this was the first time he saw a knight rushing towards the gate at such a fast speed. The ground shook from the impact of the horse's hooves. The veteran almost thought that his eyes were playing tricks on him. The world is still peaceful right now. Is there a war in the north already? The veteran immediately recognized the knight's attire. It was one of his own. There was an urgent report. Hood was an experienced veteran. He pushed the slow-moving novice aside and gripped the capstan with his bulging veins. The gate immediately creaked as it rose. The knight did not stop at all. He flashed across the drawbridge like a bolt of lightning and went straight into the castle. The report in his hands was quickly passed to the castle's attendant, who then passed it to the steward. It did not take much time to pass it up the chain of command. Count Randner had set 3 levels of urgency for his letters, and this letter was one of them. It had been almost 10 years since such a report appeared. Most of it was military news. Soon, the steward rang a bell. The bell was connected to Count Randner's room by a string. Most nobles could use magic, but Count Randner had a hobby. He knew a little about magic because he believed that magic was not a safe thing to do. If he could use machinery, he would definitely not use magic. This was a well-known anecdote among the nobles. When the bell rang on Count Randner's left hand, he was conversing with his guest. Count Randner had a head full of white hair, but no one could tell how old he was. He had participated in the November War. The tragedy of the November War had nothing to do with the nobles. It was a war that greatly damaged the kingdom, and the nobles still remembered it clearly. Monsieur the Count wore a monocle, and was neatly dressed, with a black ermine coat with a ruffled ruff of silver, and a handsome beard, though there was a faint smile of benevolence on his face. But to others, this smile signified an unfathomable emotion. Especially the guest sitting below. This guest was not from Kurlutz, and many people like him did not even admit that they were from Aween. In Erwin's SS, they had a common name, Highlanders. Highlanders, as the name suggested, were the people of the mountains. There were many tribes in Wone that were called Highlanders, and most of them were barbarians. Erewhon's Highlanders were a branch of the Nautai people. They were considered uncivilized 200 years ago, but after being ruled by the kingdom, they gradually integrated into the civilized world. However, there was one thing that did not change. The Highlanders had always pursued their own independence. Of course, this independence was not tolerated by the kingdom. Thus, the borders of Ranner had never been peaceful, and there were all sorts of conflicts and border wars all year round. Of course, not all Highlanders were like this. There were some who were willing to accept the rule of the kingdom. For example, the guest sitting beside Ranner came from a region under Ranner's rule. His purpose in coming here was very simple. He hoped that Count Ranner could reduce the taxes in the south. Due to Madara's invasion, it was an open secret that Madara's army was still entrenched in the south. The flames of war had a devastating effect on the local agriculture and production. Many regions had almost no harvests, and it was difficult to even survive, let alone pay heavy taxes. However, the kingdom did not seem to notice this, and its rule over the Highlanders became even stricter. Count Ranner listened carefully to the guest's story. He maintained a smile on his face and did not say anything. For someone of his age, his smile made him seem like a kind old man, but the guest sitting below him did not dare to think so. Most people who thought so did not have a dignified ending. Just as the envoy was about to state his request, the bell on Count Ranner's left hand began to ring. The Count's expression changed slightly. This was the first time he could not maintain a smile on his face since this afternoon. He could not remember how long it had been since he received an urgent report. The old man frowned slightly and stood up. However, he did not appear to be rude at all. He politely nodded to the envoy and said, "My apologies, please wait for a moment. Allow me to leave for a moment." "Please, my lord." The envoy stood up in fear and trepidation, not daring to show the slightest dissatisfaction. The old count left the study and opened a door to a room next to it. He immediately saw his aide and assistant waiting for him. Count Ranner did not maintain a calm expression in front of his aide for many years. Instead, he immediately asked, "What's the matter?" "It's related to Tonajol." The aide replied. "Is it the same matter as last time?" The count took a silver snuff bottle from a servant beside him and took a puff. "That trash still hasn't been dealt with. It's been half a month." The old noble said angrily. "There's a new report this time. It was sent by Lord Paulus." "Lord Paulus?" Count Ranner paused for a moment. Lord Paulus was Grodon's retainer, but he was also his old subordinate. Lord Paulus had participated in the November War with Count Ranner. Even though he only participated in a few small battles at the end of the war, he was still Count Ranner's most trusted aide. Count Ranner did not doubt Lord Paulus' loyalty to him and his family. When he heard that the report was from the old knight, he immediately calmed down and asked, "What did he say?" The aide did not answer. Instead, he passed the letter to Count Ranner. "Brando." Princess Griffin's thin eyebrows finally moved slightly when she heard the name. A hint of surprise flashed in her pale silver eyes. The surprise only lasted for a moment before she furrowed her brows. "That young man told you that his name is Brando?" The half-fairy princess raised her eyelashes slightly and looked at the guests in front of her. Most people wouldn't easily reveal their true identity under such circumstances. That's for most people. This was the first time Count Bar interrupted. He placed his hand on his chest and bowed slightly, "But I don't think he's an ordinary person. Someone who has such a close relationship with the Silver Elves can't be that ordinary." "Your Highness," Griffin crossed her slender fingers and rested them on her chin. She was lost in thought for a moment. Golden Apple, Silver Elf, Dragon Magic, Highland Knight. She lowered her head. "You said he's a silver-ranked warrior?" "I'm afraid so." Makarov nodded. 20 years old. Princess Griffin looked at Eichel, but her heart was in turmoil. Auberbeck clearly told her that the young man was at most a black iron. Isn't that the same as Mr. Eichel? He's a true genius, Bugha replied. There's another interesting thing. His swordsmanship. What about his swordsmanship? His swordsmanship has a shadow that I'm very familiar with. It's like someone I know. Mr. Bugha, please continue. Sword Saint Darius. Sword Saint Darius. Griffin was puzzled, but Mr. Bugha, you said that the young man uses the standard Erowin's military swordsmanship. It's not the same style as Grandmaster Darius, right? Sword Saint Darius also knows how to use military swordsmanship, Fleetwood replied. Your Highness, have you forgotten that he was born in the military? Improved swordsmanship. Princess Griffin's heart skipped a beat. Fleetwood continued, but a 20-year-old silver-ranked swordsman is already very rare. The old man glanced at Eichel as he spoke. The young man lowered his head in embarrassment. The half-elf girl also felt a little emotional when she heard this. The Champions Tournament had just ended, and a group of similarly outstanding youths had emerged. She couldn't help but wonder if Mother Marcia was still looking after Aween. But if that's the case, why is the situation so difficult? Why do I feel so powerless? Griffin felt a little tired, but she immediately used her extraordinary willpower to divert her attention. She took a deep breath, and her face lost some color. But she still asked seriously, also, Grandmaster Fleetwood. Your Highness. You said that the golden apple in the young man's hand really didn't connect with his soul. Yes, I'm sure that I didn't see wrongly, Fleetwood replied. I can guarantee this with the honor of being a court magician for decades. This time, Griffin was really tempted. It was said that the golden apple could change a person's fate and make them change completely. If she had the golden apple, would her weak brother be able to become the real king of Erowin? But what puzzled her was that anyone who got their hands on the golden apple would immediately think of a way to take it for themselves. But why was that young man unmoved? Was it just a fake? Impossible, her teacher wouldn't have seen wrongly. But Griffin thought that since the young man had such a close relationship with the Silver Elves, he might not be an ordinary person. Maybe he had other plans for the golden apple. Griffin thought of the legends of the Highland Knight, dragon magic, and the Silver Elves, and her heart beat faster. Griffin raised her head, her eyes shining. Can we find a way to win him over? Win him over. Everyone was stunned. Of course they wanted to. Whether it was his relationship with the Silver Elves or the owner of the Golden Apple, they were willing to do so. But they had already offended him, so what could they do? Although the young man showed that he had a good impression of the royal family, it didn't mean anything. It's a little difficult, Makarov immediately replied. No. Griffin smiled and shook her head. She thought it was a little funny. Maybe it's not as difficult as you think, if it's the same person. Everyone was stunned. Griffin picked up a letter in front of her with 2 fingers and handed it over. Take a look. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 329. This was the battlefield from more than 10 days ago. There was a faint smell of gunpowder in the air. Even though it was winter, the corpses had been cleaned up according to Brando's strict requirements. The spread of the plague was no joke, and even though the weather was cold, the youths were not willing to take the risk. Thus, apart from the bloodstains on the open ground, there were only fragments of armor and weapons scattered across the grass to prove that a fierce battle had taken place here. A black-feathered bird, a raven or a black-feathered blackbird, flew over the battlefield from a low altitude. The north wind was bleak, and the weather was getting drier and colder by the day. Due to the lack of a sacrifice, Brando had no choice but to deal with the corpses in a simpler way. The black pillars of smoke in the sky were proof of this. The smoke rose above the forest like a scene from the end of the world. When the scouts carefully entered this old battlefield, they couldn't help but look at the black pillar of smoke in the southern sky with trepidation. They crouched down, carefully inspecting the battlefield before standing up and looking at each other in dismay. They were scouts from Paulus. Ever since they received news of Lord Maxon's defeat, they had traveled day and night to this place. At first, they did not believe that the rioters were that capable. But when they passed by Lord Maxon's territory, they were surprised to find that it had been occupied by another group of people. Some of them had seen those people before. It was a mercenary group called the Amber Sword. A few months ago, they had led a group of refugees across the border, saying that they were going to explore the wilderness. The last news of them was that they had stopped at Port Gris, but only the heavens knew why they had returned here. But the answer to the scouts' doubts was simple, because Brando knew that Lord Maxon would attack Abes. Since that was the case, there was no need to be courteous. In the letter he sent to the Druids, he requested for Leto to immediately bring his men across the Parton wastelands. Once Lord Maxon made his move, they would immediately raid his lair. Poor Lord Menta had not the least idea that a mob could be so bold, and had, in fact, suffered a great loss from the very beginning of the war. Of course, he himself did not know. By the time he found out, he had already become Brando's prisoner. However, the scouts didn't know about these details. They only sensed the presence of the troops with the keen instincts of spies. They hurriedly left Lord Maxon's territory and traveled south through the night, crossing the Gris River and arriving at the land where a great battle had taken place not long ago. Of course, in Brando's words, the war in their hearts was called a village-level armed melee. He had seen real battles before, and he was not worried about whether he could defeat Lord Maxon or not. This was also why he dared to let Rabban and Cornelius take command of the Firebrand Legion. However, Brando also understood that there would be a fierce battle ahead. At this moment, one end of this fierce battle was in the hands of the scouts who had sneaked into the young man's territory. The rumors are true. Sir Maxon has already lost, and it was a crushing defeat. One of the scouts stood up after inspecting the surroundings, reporting to his companions. Everyone fell silent. Although they had already expected this result, the news of Lord Maxon's defeat had already spread across the Gris River. It wouldn't take long for the news to reach Lord Paulus' ears. However, they still couldn't help but feel a chill run down their spines. Everyone's gaze turned towards the most experienced scout in the group, who was also the one who spoke. The experienced scout pondered for a moment before speaking. The most important thing is to pass the news back. This matter is a little strange. I've been a scout for so long, but I've never heard of such ferocious rioters. He looked around. This is an ambush. An ambush? I heard that Captain Carglass also participated in this battle. Carglass was Lord Maxon's son. If one's memory was good enough, they would remember that this young man had once served under Lord Paulus for a period of time. However, that was not the case. Carglass did not boast because Lord Paulus did not have any children of his own. He had always treated this young man as his own son and passed on all his experiences in war to him. Carglass' performance did not disappoint the old knight. He performed outstandingly in the battle against the Highlanders and had a high reputation among Lord Paulus' subordinates. Even if he wanted to join Princess Griffine's side, the old knight had also agreed to it. Lord Paulus might be loyal to Count Ranner, but he was more inclined towards the royal faction. He hoped that this disciple of his would be able to assist Erwin on the path of revival. Why would Captain Carglass be ambushed? When he was leading us, we didn't fall for the tricks of the Highlanders. The scout added with some doubt. The scouts fell silent. This matter was too strange. But the old soldier waved his hand and said, I have a suggestion. Let's split into two groups. On one hand, you will bring the message back to Lord Paulus. The other will continue to move forward and try our luck at ABs. That's too risky. A young scout said. No scouts are willing to take the risk. The old soldier waved his hand. I have the highest position here. Listen to my orders. All of you go back. Leave 2 people with me. The scouts looked at each other after hearing the order. They were not worried that they would encounter any danger since they were all elites under Lord Paulus. However, ever since they came to the south, there was a sense of mystery. This was the first time they wanted to retreat. While the scouts were arguing outside the forest, Rabin and Cornelius looked at each other. They turned around and saw a young man wearing a red robe sitting on a rock not far away. The subterranean dweller Chieftain Tajiv was looking at the county with fear. This young adept's spell had completely concealed their auras. Even the most skilled of scouts would not be able to find them. Rabin was not sure if the experienced scouts would be able to detect them at this distance. When he served in the Karsuk Cavalry Regiment, he had seen many scouts in the army. Sometimes, as a cavalryman, he would occasionally act as a scout or 2. However, he had only seen experienced scouts like those outside in the most elite brigades. They were definitely first-rate elites. However, he was more surprised by the county's identity. He came from Karsuk and had seen the mysterious Highland wizards before. He was 100% sure that the county was the same type of people. They had the same aura, the aura of the Highland and the Black Tower. He had heard that Brando was a Highland knight, and at this moment, he believed it. But a Highland knight who had a mentor as his squire. What kind of existence was that? While Rabin's mind was in a mess, Cornelius once again withdrew his gaze from the forest. How bold. He was talking about the scouts outside. The scouts had split into 2 groups. One group was heading towards ABs, while the other was heading north to return to Lord Paulus. They parted ways outside the forest and disappeared into the distance. Hey, Seal looked in that direction and raised his eyebrows slightly. His expression was very similar to Brendel's. In the young wizard's mind, Brendel could be said to be the best master. He was enigmatic and seemed to know everything. He had been trying to imitate Brando's every move recently, and there were signs of him going crazy. However, he immediately laughed at himself. Carglass. I didn't expect that little guy to be so famous among the scouts under Lord Paulus. He has been clamoring for a duel with one of you every day. Don't you 2 have any objections? Rabin and Cornelius's expression immediately became strange. During the ambush against Lord Maxon, the one who caused them the most trouble was the youth called Carglass. Even Rabin, a veteran, was full of praise for the young man's ability to judge the battlefield. If they hadn't captured Lord Maxon alive in the end, they might have been killed by the young man. However, the county wanted to make fun of the Nightsong Tiger, Rabin, and Cornelius. They had promised that there would be no problems, but in the end, they made a mistake. If the county had acted personally, Carglass would have been captured even if he had grown wings. However, it was precisely because of this that the young man was still unconvinced. Although he didn't say anything like starting over as a soldier, he was still clamoring for a duel with Cornelius, the Nightsong Tiger, or Rabin. The youth's swordsmanship was also very good. Cornelius had wanted to teach him a lesson, but he did not expect that he would suffer a loss. From then on, the Nightsong Tiger, Rabin, and Cornelius would take a detour whenever they went near the dungeon to avoid embarrassing themselves. The county had told Brando that there was a child that he needed to educate, and in fact, he was referring to this youth. Seeing the 2 leaders' strange expressions, the youth smiled and shook his head. So, how do you plan to deal with this matter? He changed the topic and pointed outside. How do we deal with it? The silver-haired middle-aged man looked at the county with a questioning gaze. The 3 of them seemed to have ignored Tajiv, which made the subterranean dwellers' leader unhappy. Speaking of which, it was his men who had discovered the scouts and immediately notified the humans. However, the county did not forget about the subterranean dwellers' leader who had not been living a good life recently. He nodded at Tajiv. Of course, this matter is still Tajiv's contribution. As for how to deal with them, we will capture them. As for how to deal with them, that is Lord Maxon's business. Tajiv puffed out its chest when it heard this. What about the others? Rabin frowned. From the county's words, it seemed like they were going to release the scouts who went back to report the matter. The county nodded. Let them go. This is Lord Maxon's wish. What does that youth mean? Rabin and Cornelius looked at each other. What does he want to do? If he were to release those scouts, it was entirely possible that Lord Paulus would be alerted. If that happened, no one could say for sure what would happen next. However, the county did not answer the question and only looked up at the sky. It seems like Lord Maxon is going to do something big this time. P.S. Aha, it's actually one more chapter. Did you guess correctly? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 330. Brando was prepared to go all out this time. After the series of events in the Shaflund mines, silver was like blood being injected into the veins of the territory, bringing vitality to the territory. At the same time, the benefits obtained from the runic dwarves' sanctuary had greatly exceeded everyone's expectations. Brando quickly found that he had the strength to deal with greater challenges. But it was not just a challenge. Because challenges also represented opportunities, just like how risks and benefits always coexisted. At this time, Brando turned his gaze to the distant north. He decided to give the nobles a louder voice. A voice about the rise of a new power. As part of the plan, this new power had to prove itself to the ancient kingdom as soon as possible, whether it was a warning to the enemy or a confidence to potential allies. Brando considered that his letter should have reached Princess Griffine's hands by now. No matter what the reason was, the news of Lord Maxon's crushing defeat finally reached Count Randner's ears. Of course, it also reached the Royal Cavalry Academy at the same time, where the princess was sitting on the mahogany desk in front of her. The half-fairy princess' thin and thick eyelashes drooped slightly as she sat on a red velvet chair, looking at the two reports on the desk. To be exact, it was a letter and a piece of parchment. Today, she wore a well-tailored military uniform, but the special silver uniform accentuated her delicate curves, adding a sense of solemnity and heroism to her delicate appearance. Griffine did not open her mouth to speak, but her pale silver eyes occasionally blinked slightly. After a while, she used her finger to lightly tap on the desk, recovering from this rare state of concentration. She raised her head. Maynard and Oberway were not here. Standing in front of the desk was another group of people. In fact, she only recognized one of them. The half-fairy princess nodded to the old man. Teacher. The old man wearing a scholar's robe was the court master, Grand Master Fleetwood. He did not have the arrogance he had when facing Brando, but bowed respectfully. The princess was his proudest disciple, but at the same time, she was also the hope for the revival of the royal faction. Even though he had absolute authority when imparting knowledge, at this time, he had to show the courtesy of a subject. Your Highness. Princess Griffine smiled faintly, her gaze sweeping across the other people. She had never seen these people before, but she recognized them one by one. The only young man who was in good spirits, but he did not know what to do. That was Eek. There was a middle-aged man standing beside the young man. Even though he had been through a lot, he still had the temperament of a noble. The half-elf girl remembered seeing him when she was very young. She guessed that he should be Makarov. Makaro the Cunning Fox. The leader of the royal faction. Next to him was a man with long and slender palms. It was obvious that he had been practicing swordsmanship for a long time. Griffin smiled. It was Bugha the Cross. The last one, without a doubt, was the rumored noble who was different from the rest, the Violet Earl. Even though the half-fairy princess had never seen Bali before, she had heard of his name. Her gaze stopped on the 4 people one by one. Based on the clues from the past reports and her own meticulous observation, she recognized these famous guests without Grandmaster Fleetwood's introduction. The son of Duke Anthony, the current successor of the Cross Sword, the former leading figure of the royal faction, and Count Bar, who was known as the cunning fox of this generation. These people could indeed be considered to be famous. Especially the youngest, Eek. Even though Anthony was only a small duchy at the border between Ampere-Seal and Erech, under the current situation, Duke Lone's support was crucial to the princess. Fortunately, Duke Anthony and Duke Erech had always been at odds, and this had already escalated to the level of hatred. Griffin's gaze stopped on Eek's face for a second. This special treatment made the young man blush. He had yet to adapt to his past identity. Anyone who suddenly jumped from a nameless mercenary to a prominent noble would be shocked. Moreover, he did not expect the princess to be so beautiful. As a half-elf, she was known as the brightest jewel in Erwin's crown. Griffin had a special kind of beauty in her temperament. It was as if she had the coldness of an elf, but also the friendliness of a human. The two opposite temperaments mixed together easily made people who saw her for the first time feel a rush of excitement. Even though she was still young, she already had the potential to cause the downfall of a city. Mr. Eek, Griffin said, Lord Macaro, Count Bali, Mr. Bugha, I'm very happy that you are here to support the royal family of Covardo at this time. She opened her mouth and pointed out their identities one by one, which obviously surprised them. Only Macaro was happy. He saw that the princess was indeed as outstanding as the rumors said. With such an heir to the royal family of Covardo, he felt that his hopes were not so slim. This cunning fox always believed that humans were the most important, but the human heart was just as important as manpower. He did not like the impulsiveness of the eldest prince. Now that he saw the princess, he felt a lot more at ease. But for some reason, he suddenly thought of another young man at this time. He quickly shook his head and expelled this experience from his memory. The Violet Count did not say anything as he looked at the 2 reports on the princess's desk from afar. He was not interested in the princess's polite words. As for determining their identity, it was not difficult. If Princess Griffin could not even do this, then she would be letting down the rumors about her. On the contrary, he was very interested in why the princess was so engrossed in the reports. He was a person like the princess, who rarely revealed her emotions. However, when they came in, the princess was reading the 2 reports with her hands on her cheeks. As he read, he even smiled slightly. Count Bar was willing to bet that the princess herself didn't even realize that she was laughing just now. Interesting. The unusual nobleman said to himself in his heart. However, he did not speak rashly. Even though he did not stick to the rules, he was not a rash person. It was not his turn to speak at this time. He looked at Fleetwood, and sure enough, the old man had already spoken. Your Highness, please don't say that. This old servant is a little late than expected. Fleetwood lowered his head and replied, there were some delays on the way. He looked up and asked, Your Highness, how is the situation in the north right now? Dark clouds are gathering. Princess Griffin looked out of the window and used a simple but appropriate word to describe the movements of the Duke's alliance in the north. Their lobbyists have already entered Ampere-Seal, and it seems that they are about to persuade the greedy merchants. Are there any plans to counter them? Makarov asked. Everyone looked at him, but after more than 10 years of experience, this cunning fox had changed. He had become much more practical, and no longer followed the rules of the noble circle. Under normal circumstances, it was not his turn to speak. But because of this, Griffin's silver eyes lit up slightly. Unlike the others, this princess appreciated such talents more. I have already asked Princess Magadol. You all know that she has a lot of connections, and has a close relationship with the Holy Cathedral. She might be able to turn the situation around. The half-elf girl replied. Is it that nun princess? Fleetwood asked tentatively. The half-elf girl nodded. Is there any protection? Makarov immediately asked. At this stage of the war, the enemy and our side's movements are almost transparent. Once Princess Magadol leaves this place, she might be intercepted. Griffin was even more impressed, and she smiled slightly. Of course, Maynard will personally lead the team. Bugha raised his eyebrows. Maynard was Madame Miller's daughter, and was related to Duke Lone. He had met her once a long time ago. At that time, she was still a little girl, but the talent she displayed in swordsmanship was already amazing. He thought that after so many years, she should have grown into an outstanding swordsman. Bugha knew Maynard, and Makarov was no exception. When he heard the name, he was obviously relieved, but he still said, Madame Miller's daughter may be outstanding, but she is still a student of the academy. I think that your highness needs a more experienced leader. Princess Griffin nodded. That is why I did not let them leave immediately, but waited for everyone to arrive. Makarov was shocked. He and Bugha looked at each other, and they were both impressed by the princess' flawless arrangements. Bugha immediately stepped forward and placed a hand on his sword. I will not refuse. Griffin nodded. The room became silent. Even though Duke Lone and the Corvado royal family had a secret agreement to reach, it was not a good time to talk about it. But everyone felt as if there was nothing else to talk about other than this matter. The pressure from the north was getting stronger, and even though everyone's expression was calm, they still felt a sense of urgency. Naturally, they were not in the mood to talk about the affairs of the nobles. Only the half-fairy princess was more relaxed. She smiled at her guests. Everyone, please have a seat. Why don't we talk about something more relaxing? I have been hearing bad news for the past few days. Tell me about some interesting things that happened along the way. If I remember correctly, Mr. Eek was once a mercenary, right? That is a unique and amazing experience among us nobles. Princess Griffin looked at Makarov as she spoke, obviously praising him as well. Also, I remember that Master Fleetwood is always punctual. This time, you must have met with some trouble. Can you tell me more about it? Griffin asked in a relaxed tone. Eek was currently in a state of absent-mindedness. He didn't have the ability to answer the princess's question. He could only stammer and stammer. It was Grand Master Fleetwood who spoke first. It's like this, Your Highness. We did meet with some trouble. It has something to do with the golden apple. The golden apple. Griffin felt her heart skip a beat as she focused her attention. This slight change in the princess's expression was hidden from almost everyone, but only Count Bar saw it. The noble who stood out from the crowd raised his eyebrows. P.S. Hey, buddy, don't tell me you don't believe this is real. There's an even bigger surprise to come. However, it seems like your support isn't that great. Chapter 331. Let's turn our attention to Paydarson. The core of Randner province was located at the border between Randner province, Urek, and Frauda. Originally, it was to prevent the Highlanders from invading the north, but as the kingdom's rule over the south gradually stabilized, it became the center of political symbolism. Currently, Randner's largest fortress was Fort Balasar, but Count Randner still preferred to place his administrative center in Paydarson. Paydarson Castle had a history of nearly 130 years. Its style originated from the revival of the Elven style during the Year of the Return of Glory, and it could be said to be one of the few surviving works of art from that era. It was also one of the proudest places of the Randner family. It symbolized the respect this family had for tradition, and this respect earned them a relatively high reputation among the nobles. Of course, this also complemented Count Randner's good reputation among the nobles of Aween for being a two-faced person. Just like the veteran gatekeeper, who had been guarding the gate of the castle for most of his life, but since the November War, this was the first time he saw a knight rushing towards the gate at such a fast speed. The ground shook from the impact of the horse's hooves. The veteran almost thought that his eyes were playing tricks on him. The world is still peaceful right now. Is there a war in the north already? The veteran immediately recognized the knight's attire. It was one of his own. There was an urgent report. Hood was an experienced veteran. He pushed the slow-moving novice aside and gripped the capstan with his bulging veins. The gate immediately creaked as it rose. The knight did not stop at all. He flashed across the drawbridge like a bolt of lightning and went straight into the castle. The report in his hands was quickly passed to the castle's attendant, who then passed it to the steward. It did not take much time to pass it up the chain of command. Count Randner had set 3 levels of urgency for his letters, and this letter was one of them. It had been almost 10 years since such a report appeared. Most of it was military news. Soon, the steward rang a bell. The bell was connected to Count Randner's room by a string. Most nobles could use magic, but Count Randner had a hobby. He knew a little about magic because he believed that magic was not a safe thing to do. If he could use machinery, he would definitely not use magic. This was a well-known anecdote among the nobles. When the bell rang on Count Randner's left hand, he was conversing with his guest. Count Randner had a head full of white hair, but no one could tell how old he was. He had participated in the November War. The tragedy of the November War had nothing to do with the nobles. It was a war that greatly damaged the kingdom, and the nobles still remembered it clearly. Monsieur the Count wore a monocle, and was neatly dressed, with a black ermine coat with a ruffled ruff of silver, and a handsome beard, though there was a faint smile of benevolence on his face. But to others, this smile signified an unfathomable emotion. Especially the guest sitting below. This guest was not from Kurlutz, and many people like him did not even admit that they were from Auen. In Erwin's SS, they had a common name, Highlanders. Highlanders, as the name suggested, were the people of the mountains. There were many tribes in Wone that were called Highlanders, and most of them were barbarians. Erwin's Highlanders were a branch of the Natai people. They were considered uncivilized 200 years ago, but after being ruled by the kingdom, they gradually integrated into the civilized world. However, there was one thing that did not change. The Highlanders had always pursued their own independence. Of course, this independence was not tolerated by the kingdom. Thus, the borders of Randner had never been peaceful, and there were all sorts of conflicts and border wars all year round. Of course, not all Highlanders were like this. There were some who were willing to accept the rule of the kingdom. For example, the guest sitting beside Randner came from a region under Randner's rule. His purpose in coming here was simple. He hoped that Count Randner could reduce the taxes in the south. Due to the invasion of Madara, and the fact that Madara's army was still entrenched in the south, it was an open secret. The flames of war had a devastating effect on the local agriculture and production. Many regions had almost no harvests. Not to mention the heavy taxes, it was difficult to even survive. However, the kingdom did not seem to notice this. Instead, its rule over the Highlanders became even stricter. Count Randner listened attentively to the guest's story. He maintained a smile on his face throughout and did not express his opinion. For someone of his age, his smile made him seem like a kind old man, but the guest sitting below him did not dare to think so. Most people who thought so did not have a dignified ending. Just as the envoy was about to state his request, the bell on Count Randner's left hand began to ring. The Count's expression changed slightly. This was the first time he could not maintain a smile on his face since this afternoon. He could not remember how long it had been since he received an urgent report. The old man frowned slightly and stood up. However, he did not appear to be rude at all. Instead, he politely nodded to the envoy and said, "My apologies, please wait a moment. Allow me to leave for a moment. Please, my lord. The envoy stood up in fear and trepidation. He did not dare to show the slightest dissatisfaction. Count Randner left the study and opened a door to a room next to it. He immediately saw his aide and assistant waiting for him. What's going on? Count Randner's expression did not remain unchanged in front of his longtime deputy. Instead, he immediately asked with a solemn expression. It's related to Tonajol. The aide replied. Is it the same matter as last time? Count Randner took a silver snuff bottle from the servant beside him and took a puff. That trash still hasn't been dealt with. It's already been half a month. The old noble said angrily. There's a new report this time. It was sent by Lord Paulus. Lord Paulus. Count Randner paused for a moment. Lord Paulus was Grodin's retainer, but he was also Count Randner's old subordinate. Lord Paulus had participated in the November War with Count Randner. Even though he only participated in a few small battles at the end of the war, he was still Count Randner's most trusted aide. Count Randner did not doubt Lord Paulus' loyalty to him and his family. When he heard that the report was from the old knight, he immediately calmed down and asked, "What did he say?" The aide did not answer. Instead, he passed the letter to Count Randner. Brando. Princess Griffin's thin eyebrows finally moved slightly when she heard the name. A hint of surprise flashed in her pale silver eyes. The surprise only lasted for a moment before she furrowed her brows. That young man told you that his name is Brando? The half-fairy princess raised her eyelashes slightly and looked at the guests in front of her. Most people wouldn't easily reveal their true identity under such circumstances. That's for most people. This was the first time Count Bar interrupted. He placed his hand on his chest and bowed slightly, but I don't think he's an ordinary person. Someone who has such a close relationship with the Silver Elves can't be that ordinary. Your Highness, Griffin crossed her slender fingers and rested them on her chin. She was lost in thought for a moment. Golden Apple, Silver Elf, Dragon Magic, Highland Knight. She lowered her head. You said he's a silver-ranked warrior? I'm afraid so. Makarov nodded. 20 years old. Princess Griffin looked at Eichel, but her heart was in turmoil. Auberbeck clearly told her that the young man was at most a iron-ranked warrior. Isn't that the same as Mr. Eichel? He's a true prodigy, Bugha replied. There's another interesting thing, his swordsmanship. What's wrong with his swordsmanship? His swordsmanship has a shadow that I'm very familiar with. It's like someone I know. Mr. Bugha, please continue. Sword Saint Darius. Sword Saint Darius. Griffin was puzzled, but Mr. Bugha, you said that the young man uses the standard Erowin's military swordsmanship. It's not the same as Grandmaster Darius, right? Sword Saint Darius also knows how to use military swordsmanship, Fleetwood replied. Your Highness, have you forgotten that he was born in the military? Improved swordsmanship. Princess Griffin's heart skipped a beat. Fleetwood continued, but a 20-year-old silver-ranked swordsman is already very rare. The old man glanced at Eichel as he spoke. The young man lowered his head in embarrassment. The half-elf girl also felt a little emotional when she heard this. The Champions Tournament had just ended, and a group of similarly outstanding youths had emerged. She couldn't help but wonder if Mother Marcia was still looking after Aween. But if that's the case, why is the situation so difficult? Why do I feel so powerless? Griffin felt a little tired, but she immediately used her extraordinary willpower to divert her attention. She took a deep breath and her face lost some color. But she still asked seriously, also, Grandmaster Fleetwood. Your Highness. You said that the golden apple in the young man's hand did not form a connection with his soul. Yes, I am certain that I did not see wrongly, Fleetwood replied. I can guarantee this with the honor of being a court magician for decades. This time, Griffin was really tempted. It was said that the golden apple could change a person's fate and make them change completely. If she had the golden apple, would her weak brother be able to become the real king of Erewhon? But what puzzled her was that anyone who got their hands on the golden apple would immediately think of a way to take it for themselves. But why was that young man unmoved? Was it just a fake? Impossible, her teacher would not have seen wrongly. But Griffin thought that since the young man had such a close relationship with the Silver Elves, he might not be an ordinary person. Maybe he had other plans for the golden apple. Griffin thought of the legends of the Highland Knight, dragon magic, and the Silver Elves, and her heart began to pound. Griffin looked up, her eyes shining. Can we find a way to win him over? Win him over. Everyone was stunned. Of course they wanted to. Whether it was his relationship with the Silver Elves or the owner of the golden apple, they were willing to do so. But they had already offended him, so what could they do? Although the young man showed that he had a good impression of the royal family, it did not mean anything. It's a little difficult, Makarov, the most pragmatic person, immediately replied. No. Griffin smiled and shook her head. She thought that it was a little funny. It might not be as difficult as you think, if it is the same person. Everyone was stunned. Griffin picked up a letter in front of her with 2 fingers and handed it over. Take a look. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 332. On the 17th of the month of autumn, written in Tonajal, Baron Abi's territory. Griffin. Your Highness Odorfice. During the battle 2 nights ago, Madara's undead army from the Black Lord Insursta's side bypassed the 4 southern territories and launched a sneak attack on Abi's castle. Not only did they cause heavy casualties, but Baron Griffin also died in the battle. As a guest of the Baron's hospitality, a knight of the kingdom, and the Lord of Valhalla, this humble servant believes that this humble servant is responsible for the defense of this place. After a night of battle, the undead have been repelled. However, in order to prevent the undead from invading again, from today onwards, I will temporarily take charge of the defense and administration of this place until the new lord personally appointed by Her Highness arrives. Makarov took the letter and read half of it. His expression turned strange. However, he was still an experienced and knowledgeable person. He coughed and continued reading. Furthermore, this humble servant is questioning Count Randner's responsibility. Why did he conceal the news of Insursta's undead army stopping in the south, and why did he allow Madara's army to bypass the 4 territories without warning? Secondly, I hope that Your Highness will forgive me. Lastly, I will attach a magic stone that recorded the images of the battlefield to prove my words. He raised his head. The magic stone is with me, the princess replied without changing her expression. Please continue reading, Lord Makarov. That's all, Your Highness. No, there's one more sentence. The princess' thick eyelashes drooped slightly. Makarov picked up the letter and saw that there was indeed a line of words at the bottom. His eyelids twitched when he saw the words, and he raised his eyebrows slightly. Brando. The scene fell silent. Makarov put the letter back in its original position with a strange expression on his face. He then looked at the others and joked, I know Baron Grodin isn't doing his job well, but this little guy is a little too daring. He thought for a moment, but could not find the right words to describe this boldness. This is ridiculous. Grandmaster Fleetwood said coldly, this is a challenge to the kingdom. He's breaking the rules of the game between nobles. Princess Griffin frowned when she heard the word rules of the game. This subtle change in expression did not escape the eyes of the Violet Countess. What do you all think? She asked. I believe in Mr. Brando's words. Eek was the first to speak. Although the young man was a bit nervous, he still stood up and said, the Mr. Brando I know is a real knight. People can be disguised, young man, said Master Fleetwood. Makarov and the Violet Countess nodded in agreement. As nobles who had experienced many conflicts, they had a much deeper understanding of human nature than ordinary people. The half-elf girl's expression was a little dull. She didn't say a word, and her expression showed neither approval nor disapproval. Her eyelashes fluttered slightly, and she looked at the young man who spoke for the first time with her silver eyes. Grandmaster Fleetwood, Eek bowed respectfully to the old man, but he did not back down. People will not lie in the face of life and death. Moreover, what I saw was actions, not words. The childishness on the young man's face slowly faded away. He looked at everyone present except for Princess Griffin and said, "Otherwise, I don't think Mr. Brando would be able to reprimand us so righteously." Even the legendary divine artifact acknowledged his words. The half-elf girl was a little surprised. She had heard Makarov and the others mention the divine artifact before. But what did Eek mean when he said that Brando reprimanded them so righteously and caused the divine artifact to react? She looked at the others curiously. Her curiosity was no different from a 15-year-old girl's curiosity towards the outside world, but there was a hint of restraint in her actions. Fleetwood didn't expect Ike to bring up the matter. They had planned to keep it a secret since it wasn't something to be proud of. But when he saw the princess's girlish eyes, he knew he couldn't keep it a secret anymore. If the princess wanted to know something, she would know it. She was smart enough to know it. The Grand Master coughed and nodded to Makarov. Makarov felt even more helpless because he was the one who was reprimanded the most. Left with no other choice, the cunning fox could only recount the entire incident. He then added, "Your Highness, we didn't mean to hide such a small matter." Princess Griffin nodded and said with tolerance, "It's not strange to have conflicts due to different viewpoints. But come to think of it, Master Fleetwood, you were the one who taught me this." Fleetwood hurriedly lowered his head in fear and trepidation. He knew that his student was blaming him for trying to hide this matter. This made the old man feel both fear and relief. The fear came from the suspicion of his superior, but the relief came from the fact that the princess was complaining instead of blaming him. This could be considered a form of intimacy. Makarov and Count Bar looked at each other and sighed in relief. The princess had already said that she wouldn't pursue this matter. Although the Violet Earl was nominally under Grand Duke Lone's command, since his lord had chosen a side, he had to serve this new alliance wholeheartedly. Griffin asked again, "But you said that when the young man called Brando reprimanded you, he reacted to the divine artifact. I'm curious, what did he say to cause such a huge commotion?" "He asked us if we still remember the beliefs of the late king." Makarov replied in a low voice. In fact, Brando's question had shaken him greatly. Every question that the young man asked was straight to the point. At least for the royal faction, it was a question of their ideals and pursuit. It sounded intolerable, but they couldn't refute it. Oh. Griffin's interest was piqued. She suddenly remembered the story that Oberway told her. It was the story of a knight leading a group of refugees to attack Madara's army. It was a story that shone in the ancient times when the blood of Erewhon's nobles had yet to turn cold. But what made her heart sway was that this story really happened in the same era as her. That was why she remembered the knight in the story. But today, she couldn't help but recall that scene. "Can you tell me more about it?" she asked subconsciously. Makarov was in a difficult position. For the first time, the Violet Count beside him took the initiative to stand up. He replied, "Let me repeat." "Thank you." Griffin nodded slightly. Count Bar's expression turned serious. "I remember that during the most glorious era of Erewhon. Erewhon's knight held a bugle and a swallow-tailed flag. When the bugle sounded, the blades of the kingdom charged forward. The room suddenly became quiet. Makarov sighed and continued Count Bar's words. I remember that the battlefield was a sea of flags embroidered with the golden coat of arms of Corvado, Grenoires, and Enrich. I remember that the nobles of that era still kept their oaths. Do you still remember that oath? Of course. Griffin closed her eyes and clasped her hands together. She crossed her fingers and put them to her nose as if she was praying. The answer in her heart was clearer than anyone else. She silently said, I swear the oath of the sage under this sword. I vow to lead my people away from strife and slaughter, away from the arrogance and greed of the nobles of the empire. I vow to not repeat the cold-blooded mistakes of history. I vow to make the nobles of this new kingdom follow the spirit of chivalry. I vow to be fair and strict, upright and brave, merciful and generous. I vow to uphold this vow with all my strength. When the last syllable fell, the weak and strong half-fairy princess was in a daze. What the young man said was so clear that it seemed to have hit the weak spot in her heart. Griffin always thought that she was strong enough, but when someone understood her lifelong dream, the strong half-elf girl was still stunned. She didn't know that there was another her in the other world, and she was using the same determination and hard work to carry out her dream. In that world, Owen was like a small boat in the middle of a stormy sea, but she steered the boat forward with unparalleled faith. The dream that ran through Erwin's main storyline in the Amber Sword. It was like a light in the dark, attracting all the moths. Whether it was the Valkyrie or Erwin's players, countless people stepped forward to let their dreams overlap, just to realize the dream of the Princess Regent. In that dream, the late King Eric swore under the sword to lead his knight to break through the darkness and bring warmth and peace to everyone. That dream was shattered. But at this moment, the dream had just been born. Princess Griffin opened her eyes, and the hesitation of the past few days seemed to be swept away. Although the dark clouds in the northern sky were getting thicker and thicker, and the first snow seemed to be ready to fall, she felt that she had found the direction. He's right. The half-elf girl's expression was a little more serious. But dreams can only be realized by breaking reality. The difficulty will not be reduced because we have become determined. The question is, how do we deal with it? What do you think? She looked up and asked. Tell me your thoughts on this matter. P.S. There are always countless prophetic emperors. You've all worked hard, so I'll satisfy you all a little. Chapter 333. He's trying to get on our good side. Makarov replied succinctly. Interesting. The Violet Count smiled. Even though the young man was impulsive, he was not reckless. He was indeed interesting, and the fact that the young man sent the letter at such an opportune time was extremely good. This was obviously not a coincidence. Bar raised his head and glanced at Makarov, thinking that the old fox must have noticed this as well. But what does he want? If he wants support, it's too naive to rely on a letter that can't even be considered a pledge of allegiance. Someone who can send such a letter is definitely not so naive. But if he only wants a promise from the royal faction and the princess, then how is he going to resolve the crisis? Empty words will not be able to stop an army. The Violet Count was suddenly very curious. This young man's actions were like walking on a tightrope, dangerous and exciting. But what made him even more interested was that this was the first time he could not see through the outcome of a matter. Interesting. He just wants us to shelter him from the wind and rain. Fleetwood furrowed his brows. How can there be such a good thing, Your Highness? If we agree to his request, we will greatly offend Count Ranner. Princess Griffin furrowed her brows. Count Ranner was not a reliable ally to her, and it was more like a knife that was hanging behind her back. But this old man had not made his stance clear. Just like what her teacher said, it would be unwise to force him to side with the royal family. Humph, an old fox. Griffin rubbed her forehead in annoyance. I don't think that young man doesn't know about this. Makarov thought for a while and interrupted. He should know who's more important in our hearts, him and Count Ranner. Makarov, you mean, Princess Griffin muttered to herself for a moment, and her silver eyes lit up. She looked at the letter on the table. If that's the case, why did he send this letter? I don't think it's to mock our intelligence, Makarov asked. This witty remark made the Violet Countess smile. Princess Griffin's expression also became gentler. Only Woods snorted softly. That's right. There are two meanings behind the word shelter. Count Bar agreed with Makarov's point of view. I think this young man is trying to be friendly with us, but he doesn't want to join us. He knows his place very well. Then what does he want to do? Grandmaster Fleetwood's snow-white eyebrows twitched. Although he was Erwin's chief court magician, he had devoted his whole life to learning more advanced magic skills, so he still didn't know much about the fights between nobles. What does he want to do? Didn't he make it very clear? The Violet Earl smiled. Although Grandmaster Fleetwood was not good at reading people's minds, he was still a wise man who had made it this far on the path of wizardry. Are you saying that he wants us to admit his words? Grandmaster Fleetwood asked. He frowned. Even though he did not have a good impression of the young man, he had to admit that it was a worthwhile investment if he could gain Brendel's goodwill. The old man knew his place. He was Erwin's court magician, the mentor of this half-fairy princess, and Grandmaster Fleetwood. His personal likes and dislikes had to be placed behind the interests of the group. There's no need to accept his words. This youth's goal is clear. He wants to go against Count Randner, but he wants to avoid attracting everyone's attention. Makarov was the one who saw through Brendel's intentions the clearest. His target is Count Randner, but he wants to avoid being attacked by everyone. But his actions are already a challenge to all the nobles. No one has ever dared to take over a legitimate noble's territory. This precedent, the old man shook his head worriedly. This young man didn't take it by force. Count Bar shook his head and said in amusement. Makarov glanced at him. He was curious why the Violet Count, who usually did not have any preferences, would side with the young man. However, he still replied, that depends on how others interpret it. Most importantly, how we interpret it is. Sometimes, an excuse and a direct confrontation are two completely different things, Makarov replied. His letter said that the magic stone used to record the information. Has your highness seen it? I did. Griffin nodded. There is indeed Madara's army, and there are more than a few of them. Griffin snorted. I don't want to get involved in the conflict between Count Randner and Madara, but, she did not finish her sentence, but the dissatisfaction in her words was very obvious. He's well prepared. Count Bar was referring to Brando. He was starting to admire the young man more and more. Then let's see what benefits we can get. Makarov's expression became serious. We can't give up on Count Randner. But there's something that surprised me. Everyone looked at Makarov, waiting for him to continue. He seems to have seen through our relationship with Count Randner. He wants to use us as a pawn. A pawn? Grandmaster Fleetwood was puzzled. Amazing. Count Bar's eyes lit up. Even he did not see through Brendel's intentions. This is a good move to force Count Randner into a corner. Yes, Makarov nodded. Unlike the Violet Count's surprise, Makarov was a little apprehensive. Putting aside how Brando managed to guess the thoughts of the royal faction, just his foresight towards Erwin was enough to make him raise his guard. This young man is trying to get on our good side. Count Randner should know that there are no secrets between nobles. Then, Makarov continued, what do you think that old fox will do? If he chooses to side with Duke Arek, what kind of situation will he face? He will be attacked from the back. The Violet Countess listened quietly. She couldn't help but look at the old leader of the royal faction, whose hair had turned gray, but who was still as elegant as ever. She couldn't help but think to herself, only this person could see through the situation so clearly. As expected, the older the wiser. But what benefits does he have by doing this? Princess Griffey nodded in agreement after listening to Makarov's words. He's willing to be our pawn. If we can get Count Randner to side with us, we can abandon him at any time. I'm sure he understands this. Grandmaster Fleetwood was startled. He felt that the young man was not as hateful as he thought, but he still hesitated. That young man seems to have a good impression of us. He might be willing to side with us. Besides, we're the only ones who can cover this up for him. Count Bar glanced at the old man. A scholar will always be a scholar, and he will never become a politician. He continued, what this young man wants is simple. He wants to play a game of balance. He's choosing a side, and he's certain that Count Randner will not side with us. What a gambler. A voice came from outside the door. The knight outside opened the door, and a noble wearing a mink coat walked in. Seeing the familiar face, Makarov was slightly startled. Oberway. When he was still in the royal faction, Oberway was just a smart and capable young man. But at this moment, the impulsiveness and sharpness on his youthful face had receded, and his temperament had become steady and sharp. Oberway looked at Makarov and bowed slightly to the princess, Your Highness. He then greeted Makarov, Lord Makarov. Oberway's position in the king's party was slightly higher than Makarov's, but Oberway's humble attitude made Makarov very happy. He nodded and smiled, Lord Oberway. You're welcome. Oberway raised his head and replied, Let's continue the topic from before. I believe that Lord Makarov and Count Bar's analysis is not without reason, but I have something to say about what the young man wants. The room became silent. Everyone's gaze was on the uninvited guest, especially Princess Griffin. Out of everyone present, she was the only one who knew that the Wolf Baron was the one who understood the youth the most. Oberway looked around and smiled. Some people are not worthy of being chess pieces, they are mediocre. Some people unconsciously become chess pieces for others, they are fools. But if this young man takes the initiative to become our chess piece, then he is a chess player. Chess player. Yes, even if he only controls one chess piece, he can still be considered a chess player. It's just that in this game of chess, he's already on the same level as us. Oberway paused. He's a chess piece, but so are we. It's just that we have more resources. Everyone was silent. So, Oberway, you're saying that he wants to participate in this game? Even the half-elf girl was in disbelief. She took a deep breath and said, Isn't this like trying to gain something without risking anything? This is too infuriating. Yes, Oberway shook his head and saw the helplessness in Makarov's eyes, but we can only choose to accept because his proposal is the most beneficial choice for us. What a cunning fellow. Fleetwood shook his head and suddenly felt that he should not have participated in this discussion. He rubbed his forehead. Then what should we do? The old man asked tiredly. Just smooth things over. Oberway made the final decision. As for the rest, he smiled. Let's just watch the young man perform. Perform. Everyone was in disbelief. Even Eek, who had the most confidence in Brando, could not help but worry. On one side was a young man with nothing, and on the other side was the cunning and powerful Count Randner. Perhaps Brando had the Silver Elves behind him, but the Silver Elves had already made it clear that they would not interfere in Erwin's internal strife. Then where did his confidence come from? Princess Griffin was the only one who looked at the report on the table thoughtfully. There was only a simple sentence written on the report, Trendheim, Sir Maxon suffered a crushing defeat. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 334. After Count Randner finished reading the report in his hand, he gently placed the parchment on top of the fireplace. This old noble who had experienced many hardships in life fell into a rare silence. After a while, He raised his head and looked at his trusted aide with a gloomy expression. "You're trash, and your subordinates are trash as well." "How long ago was this report?" "Half a month ago." "It's been half a month, and Tonajul has caused such a huge mess." "My lord, this might not be a riot." Count Randner's trusted aide said, "No matter how weak Lord Maxon is, he shouldn't have been defeated by a bunch of mobs. They're mercenaries, but mercenaries are annoying flies. If they don't smell the stench of profit, they won't come buzzing over." Count Randner replied, "There's someone behind this." Even though the report mentioned that Grodin had offended the mercenaries, the old noble who had experienced many hardships in his life knew that they would not easily go against a lord without sufficient conditions. They would definitely think that Grodin had Count Randner's backing. Count Randner calmed down and tapped the emerald ring on his right index finger with his left hand. Those who were familiar with him knew that this meant that he was deep in thought, and should not be disturbed when he was deep in thought. Count Randner's trusted aide saw this and shut his mouth, waiting for him to make a decision. "I'm only concerned about two things," Count Randner replied after a long pause. "First, is Grodin dead or alive? Second, who is the person behind all this?" Count Randner's trusted aide lowered his head and pretended to listen carefully. He knew that this important person had not finished speaking yet. But at this moment, the door was opened with a creak, interrupting Count Randner's words. A tall youth rushed in from outside. "Father." The youth's voice was faster than the person's, and his voice was full of energy. "How many times have I told you to knock before you come in?" Randner looked at the newcomer and replied coldly, "How many times have I told you to knock before you enter?" "Didn't you tell me before, father?" A man of great ambition doesn't bother with trifles. The young man strode to his father's side. This young man was Count Randner's second son, and he was the only one who did not receive a fief at his age. He gave up his fief on his own accord and insisted on staying by Count Randner's side. Count Randner naturally understood his son's thoughts, but he did not mind. "It seems like you already know." The urgent news had alarmed the entire castle. He did not think it was strange for his son to rush over so quickly. If he did not know, it meant that his son was not alert enough. "Well, did something happen?" The young man looked around, then casually sat on the sofa at the side and raised his head to ask. "Something happened to your brother?" "Really?" Count Randner raised an eyebrow, and for the first time, he spoke with a hint of anger in his voice. "Why do you sound so happy when your brother is in trouble?" "I'm sorry, father." The young man picked up the cup on the side and then put it down with a smile. "I know it's not very good, but I have no choice. I still don't know how to hide my emotions." The smile on his face was obvious, and it was obvious that Count Randner was right. Count Randner shook his head. He was the same in the past, but this was a small matter in his eyes. The conflict between families was one thing, but it was different when outsiders hurt his descendants. This was a precedent that could not be set in any noble family. Even the conflicts between nobles rarely involved killing each other. Conspiracy and violence were two different things. The blood of nobles was precious, and it could not be spilled in vain. When Count Randner received this report, he had already made up his mind to take revenge in a bloody manner to serve as a warning to others. However, he did not think that this matter was as simple as it seemed. He patted the report and said, "There's a riot in Tonajul, and we don't know if your brother is still alive or not." He paused for a moment, "But I think he's most likely dead." Count Randner snorted coldly and ordered his trusted aide to explain the current situation to him. Lord Maxon was defeated. The young man shook his head when he heard that his brother was killed by a group of rioters. In his eyes, rioters were rioters, and it was too shameful for a lord to die in a riot. Even he could not help but feel a little gloomy. No matter what, Lord Maxon was still his younger brother, and it was hard for him to raise his head in front of outsiders. But when he heard the news of Lord Maxon's defeat, his expression changed completely. This was not a riot. The young man might be carefree, but he was a person with dense thoughts. He immediately stood up and said to Count Ranner, "Father, there's something fishy behind this. Please allow me to summon the army immediately. I will make the person behind all of this pay the price." Count Ranner looked at his son and shook his head in disappointment. "Do you know who's behind all of this?" The young man was stunned for a moment before he replied, "As long as the army presses on the border, they will reveal their true colors." "You're not too stupid." Count Ranner's expression softened a little, but he still shook his head. "It's not a bad idea, but someone is waiting for us to make a fool of ourselves. If you mobilize the army, won't you be sending the laughingstock to them?" The young man frowned. The experienced old man tapped his forehead. "You need to use your brain more. The sword in your hand can destroy your enemies, but it can't lead you to victory. Think about it again. Of course, whoever benefits from it has the motive." The young man replied. "Correct." Count Ranner nodded. "The kingdom is divided into 3 factions, but the most likely to do so is the princess's faction. That cunning little girl really made people feel uneasy. Because what they lacked was time, she wanted to pressure me. She's underestimating the Ranner family. But it's not impossible that someone is trying to sow discord, father." The young man did not want his father to side with a wreck because of this. He wanted the princess to pull him to her side. Of course, it would be best if they could form an alliance through marriage. With the princess's help, his position as the heir to the family would be in the bag. Besides, he had long heard of the beauty of the half-fairy princess. Her reputation as the most dazzling jewel on the ancient kingdom's crown was not only in Erewhon, but also in the nearby Cruz Empire. However, Count Ranner saw through his thoughts. The old man with a gloomy expression looked at his son coldly. "Don't worry, I'm not going to lose my head over this matter. I'm already past your age. Father. You must remember one thing, Andre," Count Ranner said sternly. "It doesn't matter which faction the Ranner family favors. What's important is that the Ranner family must maintain, or at least obtain, an even more independent status than it is now." The old man raised an eyebrow and said in a gloomy tone, "If you can't obtain that much, then don't think so much. It's important to set your own goals. Greedy people will only make others hate you." The young man paused for a moment, then shrugged. "Of course I understand. But what should we do now?" Count Ranner tapped the emerald ring on his right index finger and replied coldly, "That sly little girl tried to play tricks on me, so the Ranner family must pay her back in kind. She killed my son, so I'll eat her chess piece. Let's see what she's going to do next, then." The young man patted the hilt of his sword excitedly. "No, there's always an opportunity in danger. We can't handle this matter like this. If I have to personally deal with a small rebellion in a small territory, then won't the Ranner family be lowering their status?" The old count shook his head. He was dissatisfied with the young man's eagerness. "Besides, that cunning girl and Duke Arek are keeping a close eye on me. I can't afford to let them take me lightly at this time." The young man clicked his tongue and threw his sword on the sofa. "I understand, father. You have a plan." Count Ranner trembled in anger at Brendel's sloppy actions, but before he could reprimand him, Brendel had already interrupted him. "If we don't act, Lord Paulus won't be a match for those rioters, father." The young man rested his hands on the back of the sofa and leaned back comfortably with a lazy expression. "That old knight might have a decent army, but his strength is limited compared to Lord Maxon's. If Lord Maxon loses, then this knight won't win either, right?" Count Ranner nodded with a gloomy face. Even though he did not like his son's behavior, he had to admit that his second son was the most outstanding among his sons. While the rest of his sons were not as useless as Grodin, they were still mediocre. "Let me think, father," the young man replied. "Don't tell me you want those skeletons from Madara to act. They might have the ability to do so, but they are not of our race. Lord Paulus, that honest knight, might not be able to control them. In other words, father, do you really trust them? That's smiling and searched a dragon. I heard that he's just a knight in Madara, why not? Count Randner said in a low voice. He no longer looked at his son and turned to his confidant. Help me draft 2 letters, Count Randner. The confidant raised his head. The first letter, write it to the dark nobles of Madara. Tell them that the thing they want is still in ABs. If they still want to complete the deal with me, then they have to contribute. Count Randner ordered coldly. The second letter, give it to the messenger of the mountain people. Don't they want to be exempted from taxes? Tell them that if they are willing to participate in this war, not only will I reduce their taxes, I will also provide food for their troops. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support legal reading. Chapter 335. The young man on the sofa snorted at the Count's order. He had to admit that it was a good move to borrow someone else's knife to kill. However, the subordinate was slightly taken aback and quickly lowered his head. No one knew better than him the consequences of the Count's order. Madara's invasion had brought about an unprecedented predicament for the Highlanders. At this moment, to the people living in the mountains and forests, whether it was tax exemption or not, it could be said to be a life-saving measure. Thus, he believed that the Count would not refuse, nor could he refuse. As for war, wasn't war a common occurrence for the barbarians? He immediately calculated in his mind. Even if he did not include Madara's and Lord Paulus's troops, the Highlanders' army alone would exceed 10,000 men. This number made him a little shaken. This time, the Count, who had always been low-key, was determined to show Duke Aurek and Princess Griffine his strength. But how many years had it been since he last did this? 10 years, or 20 years? Since the last time the kingdom was in turmoil, it was as if a generation had grown up in the blink of an eye. But this did not mean that the old man had lost his courage. The subordinate who had followed Count Randner for many years secretly glanced at his lord and the young man on the sofa. The old Count's hair was already white, but his eyes were gloomy and sharp. The 3 men present understood that once these 2 letters were sent out, the footsteps of war could no longer be stopped. But the situation was just so strange. When everyone's attention was focused on the war in the north, who would have thought that the beginning of the civil war would unfold at the southernmost border of this ancient country that no one paid attention to? In Trondheim, which was so remote that it seemed to have been forgotten by everyone. The footsteps of war quietly approached. But at this moment, Brando did not have much understanding of the army that came from the Randner region and was about to arrive at the border. Perhaps he knew that the direction of history had changed. Once the news of Lord Maxon's defeat spread, it meant that he had included himself in the huge wheel of the civil war that would decide Erwin's fate. As for the outcome, it would depend on the performance of all sides. However, at this moment, what Brando was thinking about the most was not this problem. He was currently sitting in a carriage heading to Furber from Schaflund. The carriage was bumpy due to the mountain roads, but the young man was still staring at the blue sky outside the window. For a moment, he was in a daze. The reason why he abandoned all matters related to Schaflund's silver mines and left for Castle Abes in the middle of the night was not because he received news of Count Randner's army approaching the border, nor was it because he received an accurate reply from Princess Regent. It was because of another reason. However, Brando withdrew his gaze from the changing scenery outside the window. His eyes fell on a familiar old dwarf on the opposite side of the carriage. Then, he and the dwarf stared at each other. "Mr. Odom," the young man spoke first, "I would like to know what happened to you." The old dwarf was stunned for a moment. He showed a confused expression as he stuffed a piece of dessert into his mouth. "What do you mean by what happened?" In fact, the old dwarf had already unceremoniously eaten half of the desserts that Fella prepared for him in the hidden compartment of the carriage. Now, he was about to finish the other half. Brando lost his appetite when he saw the way the dwarf ate. Of course, this was probably the dwarf's strategy. At least, it seemed to be working. "I don't remember inviting you to travel with me, right?" Brando said in an annoyed tone. "Aren't you doing well in the mines?" "I didn't ask you to leave either, so why are you always walking around in front of me?" He thought for a moment and took a deep breath before he added, "Since half a month ago. Are you talking about this?" The old dwarf almost choked. He quickly patted his chest and swallowed the dessert. Well said. Young man, this is a problem." Brando felt the corner of his eyes twitching. He felt that if he could, he would kick the old dwarf off the carriage. However, he did not have the mood to do so and coldly replied, "Mr. Odom, if that's the case, can I ask you to get off the carriage now?" "No, no, no." The old dwarf hurriedly shook his stubby hand. Of course not, of course not." "Reason?" "This. Let me think." Odom was obviously in a difficult position. He could not say that he wanted to see if Brendel had the potential to become the king of the earth and have all the ruined dwarves follow him. He felt that if he said that, Odom would definitely treat him as a lunatic. The old dwarf thought for a while and finally found an excuse. "Young man, don't you need someone to do something for you?" Brando felt that he was about to laugh out loud. "All right, then what can you do, old man?" Odom blurted out, "I can explore mines, and I'm very good at mining." I'm a disciple of the golden dwarves. You know that even though the ruined dwarves are not good at mining, the golden dwarves are good at mining." "Yes, you don't have to say any more." Brando shook his head. "Since you're so good at mining, why don't you stay in the mines?" The old dwarf froze. He stood there for a long time before stuttering, even though I'm good at mining, I actually want to change my job." He forced a smile at Brando as he spoke. It was an extremely forced smile. Oh. Brando suddenly felt that it was not that uncomfortable to talk to this old dwarf. At least he knew that his actions were strange. "Then what do you want to do?" the young man asked with a mocking tone. The old dwarf scratched his head. This was a difficult question for him. Other than working in the mines, what else could he do? Odom felt that this question was too strange. What kind of joke was this? He was a ruined dwarf who grew up in the Golden Dwarves tribe. Other than mining, what else could he do? Was this not purposely making things difficult for him? If it was any other person who asked this question, Odom would definitely teach that person a lesson. But he knew that this awkward situation was something he brought upon himself. He hesitated for a long time before finally saying with difficulty, that "I know a little, construction." Odom did not lie to Brando. This old dwarf did know a little about construction. Construction and engineering was actually his hobby. This hobby came from the fact that he believed that ruined dwarves should more or less have some knowledge about construction. But of course, his knowledge of construction did not come from the ruined dwarves' inheritance. It was something that he had pieced together. In other words, he was still a miner. That was why the old dwarf did not have much confidence when he spoke. But Brando's interest was piqued. Others might not know what the ruined dwarves did, but he knew. When he heard Odom say that he knew how to build, his eyes lit up and even his worries were thrown to the back of his mind. "You said that you know how to build." Brando's voice was raised by 3 octaves. But the young man's raised voice gave the old dwarf a fright. His originally weak answer became even weaker. I know a little," but with the stubborn nature of the dwarves, Odom suddenly realized that he could not appear weak. He was a dwarf, and not just a dwarf. He was a silver citizen, the only bloodline of the ruined dwarves. He immediately coughed and replied, "Kid, you see, everyone starts from nothing. Although I only know a little, it only means that I don't have enough experience. You also know that I used to be a miner." These nonsensical words sounded like they were full of loopholes, and even Romaine might not believe them if she was here. But Brendel, who had long been superstitious about the Rune Dwarf's talent in construction, listened to her. The young man felt that there was a chance and nodded, "I understand. You know how to build a city. You want to build a city." The old dwarf was shocked. Building a city was not an ordinary construction project. He immediately thought that if he were to build a city with his own ability, he might end up like this. He could imagine that the city he built would be located somewhere crookedly and become a famous site in the future. Of course, that would be a negative example. All the Rune Dwarves, and even other dwarves, would probably come here and say that to their descendants with a sense of pilgrimage. "See, that's the work of the boastful old dwarf, Odin. He even forgot to build a city gate." The old dwarf immediately broke out in cold sweat. He quickly shook his head to get rid of the messy thoughts because he saw the hope on Brando's face. "How is it?" Brando asked in an extremely enticing tone, "Not just building a city, but a huge fortress." "As long as it's built, your name will be passed down forever." The young man lowered his voice and spoke in a distant tone, "See, that's the work of the dwarven master builder Odin. He's the one who brought back the glory of the Rune Dwarves. Don't tell me you don't know what your ancestors were best at." The words "the glory of the Rune Dwarves" moved Odin, or rather, it gave him a huge calming pill. The scene that Brando described to him made him forget that he was a typical three-legged cat in this aspect. The old dwarf immediately confirmed his thoughts. "That's right, I'm the descendant of the Rune Dwarves. I can't be that bad." And so he nodded with all his might. "Good." Brando, who did not know what was going on, felt relieved. He felt that someone had sent him a pillow when he wanted to sleep. It seemed that Lady Martha still cared for him. With the help of a Rune Dwarf's descendant, building a fortress would not be a problem. Brando felt that he had profited greatly, and so did Odin. Both of them could see a bright future ahead of them. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 336. The gate behind the drawbridge creaked as the black carriage drove into Coldwood Castle like a ghost. The atmosphere in the castle seemed to have suddenly become silent. The mercenaries stopped to watch, and almost everyone understood the young lord had returned. Since Yuta was still in the Shaflon mines, no one had brought back the news of what had happened underground. However, everyone in the castle knew that Brando had only brought 20 men with him to quietly take over the mines. What kind of method was that? Even though the young lord's abilities were deeply ingrained in everyone's hearts, his actions had once again created an image of him as an omnipotent being. When Brando opened the carriage door, he saw that the castle was still shrouded in silence and green even though it was late autumn. The first owner of the castle had carefully selected the trees in the castle so that it would remain green even in this season. However, there were not many changes compared to when he left the castle. The only thing that changed was that Grodin's original style was much less, and the curtains in the rooms were all changed to his favorite beige color. Although the young man didn't know how Folair knew about his hobbies, the elder sister of the Wild Elf sisters, who always followed him around like a secretary, still made him feel warm in his heart. If there was anything that changed about the castle, it was that it made him feel like he had returned home. The word home was distant and unfamiliar to Brando, as if it had nothing to do with him. The old house in Butchie was like a symbol in his mind, symbolizing his starting point in this world. It had nothing to do with his home. Perhaps Brando still had a home in Bragg's, but whenever he thought of that home, there would always be a barrier in his heart. He knew that as long as he had doubts in his heart, he would not be able to face everything calmly. But today, when he stepped out of the carriage and saw every detail in the quiet castle, he felt a sense of security in his heart. Whether it was the grass and trees in the castle, the clean rooms with bright windows, or the people in the surroundings, they all had a calming feeling that seeped into one's soul. It made him feel like he was back. Brando involuntarily closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Only at this moment could he deeply feel that he was the master of this place, everyone in this castle, including those who were looking at him. What do they hope for? Is it to settle down or to live a better life? Brando suddenly had a feeling that he was not fighting alone. He thought that he finally had the dreams of so many people standing together with him. No matter what their ultimate goal was, Brando believed that he would satisfy everyone. With predictable confidence, Brando opened his eyes and saw the expressionless wild elf sister standing in front of him with her notebook in her hands. She stood straight and had a meticulous expression. Even the most professional etiquette teacher would not be able to find fault with her. To him, this elven lady was now his secretary and personal maid. He knew that this was the Nightsong Tiger's order, but she was doing her job diligently. As a former otaku, Brando did not have a fetish for uniforms, but he felt that Falern's care was very considerate. He looked at the young lady and said softly, "Thank you." The wild elf sister looked at him with her dead fish eyes and lowered her head again. She did not refute, but it seemed that she was satisfied with his thanks. "How is it?" Brando asked again. "The Shire is still in his room," Falern replied. Even though she was a maid, she had the rare strength of a silver-ranked warrior. In fact, many dukes would not have the honor of having such a personal maid. Of course, it was a different story for a shadow guard. However, using a silver-ranked elementalist as a maid was something that shocked everyone who knew about it. It was a good thing that the Nightsong Tiger and the others had not shown their true strength yet, or else Cornelius and Rabin would have been shocked by their strength. The reason why the mercenaries of Lopez were able to increase their strength was because of the 10,000 Mammoth Forest card that he had added to their cards. The effect of the 10,000 Mammoth Forest card was slightly weaker than expected, and it only increased their strength to upper silver-ranked. However, this also meant that Brando had an army of silver-ranked warriors. A silver-ranked warrior in the kingdom's irregular army could obtain the position of a leader. Furthermore, the mercenaries of Lopez's military discipline was not bad. Brando even thought of making them the backbone of his army. However, the identity of a summoned creature was still a little troublesome. Brando did not think that any of his soldiers would be willing to charge together with a commander who could revive even if they died. This matter made him rub his forehead. There was no other reason other than the fact that he did not have enough talented people around him. Other than a summoned creature, it was almost impossible to find a person who could hold their own. Even though Amandina had a calm analytical ability and broad vision, he still felt that this noble's daughter still lacked experience. In fact, Brando was a little nitpicky. After all, he had 100 years of experience in fighting against nobles. Even though it was in the game, experience would not fade no matter where it was. In the eyes of someone like him, his vision was a little too high. In the eyes of many mercenary leaders, Amandina could be said to be the best tactician. She was meticulous, calm, and had her own opinions. She was farsighted, thoughtful, and could always see things that others could not see. Not to mention, she also had a vast knowledge, as if she knew everything. In this aspect, only the Shire could talk to her. When the others were called to a meeting by this young lady, they would sometimes feel like they were in a fog. However, they had to admit that her words were very reasonable. In fact, they had long been guessing who this young lady was. Even the confidants of the nobles who gave advice to them were probably nothing special. In this aspect, Rabin was more experienced, to the point that this former captain of the cavalry looked at Amandina with a strange gaze. In his view, this young lady was one of those rich nobles with a long history who were specially trained to serve their children. Of course, being born as a rude and uneducated soldier, Rabban could not help but think that this young lady might have to satisfy her lord's less than honorable needs when necessary. This guess was not only in Rabban's mind, but more or less, the mercenaries more or less had the same thought. After all, Amandina's actions sometimes exceeded the scope of an advisor. Brando gave her a lot of power, and this kind of trust was hard to imagine. There was only one explanation. Amandina was the young lord's woman. It was a pity that Brando was not aware of this small matter, and the young lady who was aware of it turned a blind eye to it. Thus, this kind of misunderstanding was tacitly maintained. Of course, back to the main topic. Brando's dissatisfaction with Amandina was sometimes revealed, and this kind of dissatisfaction that was close to being lectured did not mean that the young lady had fallen out of favor, but it was a sign that he valued her. However, this also made them speechless at the high standards of their lord, but Brando's reprimands were not unreasonable most of the time, and thus, the mercenaries naturally had a thought in their minds, what is high? This is high. Thus, Brando was naturally shrouded in a layer of halo, and almost everyone thought that he was the real noble who was sent out by the ancient nobles to gain experience. Only the female mercenary leader Yuta, who had the most dealings with nobles, doubted this statement. Cornelius and Rabban chose to believe in their intuition, but it was a pity that a man's intuition was often unreliable. In short, in their opinion, Brando would definitely bring them a bright future. On the other hand, other than Amandina, the only one who caught Brendel's attention was Rabban, the former captain of Karsuk's cavalry squad. He was probably the only one who was calm and had a certain level of military discipline. He was even more outstanding than Jana, who was serious in her work. From Brando's point of view, Yuta's flaw was that she was too meticulous. Even though women were naturally suspicious, there were times when a person who wanted to achieve great things did not care about trifles. People who were tangled up in details would not be able to see far into the future. This was also the reason why Rabban and Cornelius were able to see through the situation quickly and accept it into his group, while Amandina was unable to fit in. The incident at the mine seemed to have dispelled her doubts. She had already assured him that he could leave Schaflund and leave her there to monitor Perkins' every move. This meant that Amandina could leave her subordinates in ABs to him without any worries. She believed that he would not take the opportunity to do anything that she would regret. But in truth, it was already a little too late. Cornelius and Rabban had already found their positions, while Amandina had to start from the beginning. She had already lost by half a step from the beginning. Thus, Brando did not have high hopes for her. As for Cornelius, even though he was strong enough, he was too sly. Brando would never trust such a person before he had the strength to control him. As a former commander, he knew how to use a person wisely. Rabban, on the other hand, was bold and calm enough to see the situation clearly. However, his only flaw was that his vision was too narrow. Brando could not help but laugh at this thought. How far could he ask a cavalry captain to see? After all, they were not players in the past who could look at the problems of this world from a perspective that transcended beyond it. Thus, players were born to be on equal footing with nobles, but these people could not. Even though people could change, Brando did not have the time to do so. The problem he was facing now was different from the game where he could slowly level up. His enemies were much stronger than him from the start, and they would not give him the time to slowly grow his wings. He looked at Rabban and Cornelius, who were also standing by the side, and could not help but shake his head. Where was the talent he needed? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 337. Brando fell into a daze the moment he stepped out of the carriage. This was out of everyone's expectations, but he quickly shook his head to get rid of this temporary worry. Compared to the troubles he had to deal with now, this matter could barely be placed at the back of his mind. He suddenly felt that his journey was full of twists and turns, and there were too many difficulties. This was the reason why he rushed back to Abby's castle. Yesterday, the Shire had sent him a telepathic message. Scarlet's condition had worsened, and she might not make it past today. Brando's mood, which had just improved recently, immediately turned gloomy. Other than the Shire, he was probably the only one who knew Scarlet's condition the best. But in order to deal with Schaflund as soon as possible, he could only force himself not to think of the worst. However, some things did not change based on subjective wishes. Even though Brando had made the most thorough preparations, Scarlet still made it to this day. In fact, on the second day after he took control of Schaflund Mine, he had ordered a group of mercenaries and militia to send Scarlet back to his territory so that the Shire could control the spread of the blood of God in her body. Although this squire of his didn't seem like a reliable person, he was still a gold-ranked wizard. He was much stronger than a gold-ranked swordsman and a half-baked elementalist when it came to these mystical fields. Unfortunately, Brando also understood that no matter how strong the Shire was, he could not reverse what had already happened. Scarlet's body had already died once. It was the blood of God's powerful energy that reversed life and death and pulled her soul back from the underworld. However, this was not without a price. The blood of God was neither a savior nor a red cross. This ownerless divine power would not be so kind as to help an ordinary person for no reason. The blood of God's goal was to preserve Scarlet's soul so that it could better integrate with the body and not cause any rejection. Once this goal was achieved, Scarlet's soul would become its enemy. The blood of God had no consciousness, and all of its actions were based on its instincts. Therefore, Scarlet would be defeated shortly after the blood of God regained control of her body. The Shire had tried their best to delay the process, but no external force could change the imbalance in Scarlet's body. Sooner or later, this day would come. Brando couldn't relax when he thought about this, and he lost most of his interest in chatting with Odom in the carriage. However, he knew that he had to finish his words. He was not only the lord that the red-haired girl had chosen to follow, but he was also the master of all the people on this land. At least for now. He could feel this responsibility at any time, so he turned around and looked at the tired old dwarf in the carriage. Odom was not used to carriages. He was allergic to silk curtains and could not stand the bumpy ride. If it weren't for Brando's words that piqued his interest, the old dwarf probably wouldn't have been able to hold on. From now on, you'll be the chief architect of the territory. Brando said, if you need anything, just tell Amandina. Brando looked back, but Amandina wasn't there. She should be accompanying Roman and Scarlet. She had a good relationship with Scarlet, and to be precise, she had a good relationship with everyone. As for Roman, he came back with the Nightsong Tiger 3 days ago to escort the silver. Of course, this was only in name, and Brando knew that Roman was just bored in Schaflund. Forget it, I'll introduce her to you in the future. Brando said, I don't have the manpower or money for the time being, but you can take over the work of repairing the walls. I'll have Cornelius and Grandmaster Bosley hand over the related matters to you. You can ask them if you have any questions. He paused for a moment. The old dwarf was a miner, so it was normal for him to not know much about construction. However, he was confident in his innate talent. There's a private library in Abby's, and there should be some books on construction. This castle was built by the previous lords, and there were no lack of architects among them. Nobles like to record their experiences, so if there are any, they should be in there. The old dwarf blinked as if he had just woken up from his dream of building a castle. Only then did he remember that the young man was only the leader of a band of mercenaries in revolt. He had known this beforehand, but he did not care at first. He was a rune dwarf, not a bird human. As for the affairs of human lords and kings, he did not care. At worst, he could just pack up his things and return to the Golden Dwarf's territory. He was a dwarf after all, and a respected old man at that. Of course, that was his self-proclaimed title, but it wasn't strange for a dwarf to not be used to the human world. Moreover, if he was chased away by Erwin's ruler, perhaps he would be regarded as a hero in the eyes of his people. Ever since the Second Holy War, the relationship between the Golden Dwarves and the humans was not good. But now, Brando's words pulled the short and fat Odin back to reality. He realized that even though he was the chief architect, he didn't have any manpower or money, and even worse, he didn't seem to have any ability. He suddenly remembered that he had agreed to something that would cost him his life. Building a city. With Martha's help, he might not even be able to build a pigsty. If the young man asked him if he had the confidence to build a castle that would go down in history, how would he answer? Ah. Yes, my lord, I, Odin, can build a castle that will go down in history, and I swear that no one will be able to break through the gates of this castle because it doesn't even have a gate. Odin could imagine that the young man in front of him would stab him to death if he answered like that. He immediately woke up and broke out in cold sweat. The ABs had even soaked his leather armor and made him shiver. However, Brando didn't notice Odin's abnormality and thought that the old dwarf was just too tired. In fact, he was also very tired. He had rushed back in the middle of the night and chatted with Odin for the entire night, but he hadn't slept yet. He didn't even get to rest for more than 4 hours a day in Schaflund. As a lord, there was always an endless amount of work to do. Brando thought that if he was in that world, he would never have thought that he would be so hardworking as an otaku one day. But that was the truth, and it still happened. This made Odin smile bitterly. He felt that he had returned to the starting point. He thought that if he was this hardworking in his previous world, he might have been able to achieve great things. Unfortunately, there weren't so many ifs in this world. He couldn't help but worry when he thought about Scarlet, and this worry mixed with exhaustion made his face pale. Falerne couldn't help but frown when she saw him like this. Odin was also stunned for a moment. He looked at the young man who was holding onto the door of the carriage and was still discussing business with him. There was no lack of trust in Odin's words, and no matter how thick-skinned he was, he could not help but feel his ears turn red. He lowered his head, not daring to face the young man's gaze. He hesitated whether he should reveal the truth or not, but in the end, he decided not to. He was afraid that Brando wouldn't be able to take it and would vomit blood and fall to the side of the carriage. Of course, he was more afraid that the young man's subordinates outside would rush up and tear him apart. No matter how brave, noble, and rare the Rune Dwarves were, they could be killed with a single stab. There was no need for a second stab. He thought for a moment and decided to just muddle through. Who knew if the Rune Dwarves were really talented in construction? Odin could only reply vaguely to Brando's words. But when the young man recalled his experience in the game, he finally grasped the crux of the matter when he talked about the drainage system and the disposal of garbage. His small eyes lit up. The Golden Dwarves were a race that was famous for building underground mines and tunnels. They were the best miners and tunnel workers, and although they did not produce much sewage when they lived in the tunnels, Odin knew that the Golden Dwarves had a unique way of dealing with household waste due to the fact that they did not bathe in their entire lives, and they ate food from the soil. In fact, a city with more than 100,000 people would produce a large amount of garbage and sewage every day. If the sewage and garbage weren't disposed of in time, it would breed diseases and plague would spread. This was one of the reasons why there weren't any large cities in areas where civilization couldn't reach. But Odin felt that he had found a direction. Drainage and disposal of garbage were similar sometimes, and he felt that he could use the Golden Dwarves' method to create a miraculous effect. As for the fortress and the city walls, and of course the city gates, he knew some of the Alpine Dwarves' construction techniques. The old dwarf realized that some things didn't seem so complicated when he focused on squeezing out his potential. After thinking it through, he finally nodded to the young lord. Brendel finally relaxed when he saw Odom nodding. He turned around to look at Cornelius and Rabin, who were not far away from him. The two commanders didn't have any expression on their faces. They knew that the young noble wasn't in a good mood, so they didn't want to provoke him. Brando retracted his gaze and said to Falerne, "All right, bring me there. Don't you need to rest?" The wild elf's tone didn't sound that concerned, but her words betrayed her thoughts. "My lord." "No need." Brando took a deep breath. Falerne might not know, but he knew that Scarlet's life could be in danger at any time. Otherwise, he wouldn't have left everything behind and rushed back in the middle of the night. After all, he had promised the red-haired girl in Schaflund that everything would be fine. That was why he had to come back and fulfill his promise. He was Brando, the man who would change the fate of this ancient kingdom. Since that was the case, he had to change the fate of everyone around him. P.S. OTL, I just realized that Kuriko had left. I haven't personally uploaded a chapter for a long time, and I even forgot to upload it. I've let you Gisu down, please forgive this sinner. P.S. OTL, I just realized that Kuriko had left. I haven't personally uploaded a chapter in a long time, and I even forgot to upload it. I've let you Gisu down, please forgive this sinner. Chapter 338. The long walkway led to a room on the southwest side of the castle, where Seal had placed Scarlet. The room's main color scheme was light green, and the branches of an ancient mangrove tree could be seen from the window. In the distance, there was a distant view of Trentheim. The dark forest and the shadows of the mountains hanging from the clouds on the horizon. When Falerne led Brando to the room, the young wizard had already received news that his master had returned and was waiting outside. "How is it?" Brando asked as soon as he saw the Shire. "Not too good," the Shire replied. "Miss Roman, Amandina, and Medisha are all inside." Brando nodded and entered the room without saying a word. Scarlet's room was not an intensive care unit, and he did not smell the strong smell of medicine as soon as he opened the door. There was even a sense of tranquility in the room. When he opened the door, he saw that the curtains in front of him were gently raised, revealing a corner of AB's castle. Brando's entrance brought a slight breeze into the room. A gentle breeze lifted the curtains of the princess bed in the middle of the room. The original owner of this bed had long been unknown, but Scarlet was currently lying on it. Under the veil, the girl's face was pale and her eyes were gently closed. It was the first time Brando saw the girl with her ponytail untied. Her soft red hair covered part of her face, making her look extremely delicate. She was very quiet. It was not the usual stubbornness of silence, but a true silence. She did not make a sound, as if she was immersed in her own dreams. Unfortunately, Brando knew that it was a nightmare. Otherwise, the girl would not have frowned slightly with a pained expression. When Medisha and Amandina saw Brando enter, they both stood up at the same time. The elven princess nodded slightly, while Amandina looked at the young man without moving, a trace of worry in her eyes. Although she didn't know what happened under Schaflund, she knew that Scarlet's situation wasn't optimistic. She had asked Seal about the situation, but the young wizard only told her to wait for the Lord to come back and deal with it. This caused her heart to sink. She was a simple girl. She had always been calm in her heart so that she could be a competent advisor. However, just like how she blamed herself for the death of her wild elf sister back in the mountains of Chablis, she didn't want anyone in the group to meet with any mishap. Amandina knew that this idea was childish and even ridiculous. Since ancient times, there was no conflict between nobles without bloodshed, but she was unwilling to give up on this point. Calm but not cold-blooded, this was something that Brando had taught her. "My lord?" the young lady asked in a low voice. Brando nodded, but he immediately saw a small figure lying on the other side of the bed, sleeping soundly. The merchant girl did not seem to notice the changes in her surroundings, to the point that a string of sparkling drool flowed out from the corner of her mouth and dripped onto the blanket. Brendel looked at the girl's expression in her dream, her eyebrows raised non-stop, and he knew that she was probably breaking through the obstacles in her dream. Of course, that was only in her imagination, and it was of no help to the red-haired girl at this moment. But the young man knew that the Romans' thoughts were extremely simple, and there was not a trace of impurity in their actions. Of course, this was except for business. Thus, he raised his eyebrows and did not have the heart to reprimand her. Brando walked to Scarlet's bedside and turned around to ask, "What is she doing?" "Telling Scarlet a story." Medisha replied. "Telling a story." The Roman girl said that when she was sick when she was young, her aunt would tell her a story. After listening to the story, her illness was cured. The silver elf girl added in a small voice. And then, seeing Medisha and the noble girl smile, Brando knew that this guy was doing something useless again. If the Roman's aunt was a witch, then she should have used a kind of magic. Holy magic was one of the witch's many spells. But this was something that could not be learned by imitation, but the Roman obviously did not realize this. He did not wake the merchant girl up, but his gaze fell on Scarlet's body. It had only been a week, but the red-haired girl had completely changed. She had lost her usual vitality and health, and her face was pale as paper. Her whole body seemed to have lost a lot of weight, and her skin gradually became transparent, and the blood vessels underneath could be seen clearly. In sharp contrast to her crystal-like skin, a layer of eye-catching black patterns was growing on her neck. These patterns spread over her slender neck and extended to her face. Seeing her like this, Brando's heart sank. The blood of God had begun to spread, and even though the Shire tried his best to suppress it, this tenacious thing could not be stopped from spreading to the brain. If this continued, there would be no red-haired girl called Scarlet in this world by tomorrow morning. Medisha and Amandina saw that their omnipotent lord did not say a word, and they immediately understood Scarlet's situation. Even though the silver elf girl was not good at expressing her feelings, she could not help but softly ask, "My lord?" Brando only shook his head. The patterns on Scarlet's body should have originated from her heart. That was the place where the blood of God was injected, which was also the heart. In fact, this was the most troublesome way to inject the blood of God. The person who used the blood of God must have been very experienced. Faced with this method of injecting the blood of God, the Shire and Brando could only be at their wits' end. If they wanted to save Scarlet, they had to kill the blood of God. But the blood of God was the only thing keeping Scarlet alive. Even if they had a way to destroy the blood of God, they would still have to kill this red-haired girl. Moreover, they did not have a way to do so. Another method was also suitable for this kind of situation where the body was occupied, or was in the process of being occupied, and that was to erase the will that dominated the body. But what made Brando helpless was that the blood of God did not have a will, and was driven by instinct. Thus, this method also sealed his path. He saw the patterns on Scarlet's neck slowly growing upwards, like blood-sucking thorns that slowly sucked away the girl's life. Or perhaps it was a slow-acting poison that would take her life once the time was up. But Brando stood by the bed, and for a moment there was nothing he could do. There was a way to quench his thirst with poison. He frowned. But at this moment, a voice sounded in his mind, "Little one." "Yes." Brando tilted his head slightly. The female voice in his mind was low and mature, and he recognized that it was Orthlus's voice. In fact, the female knight who came from the era of the War of the Holy Saints did not take the initiative to contact him often. She would only answer Brando when he had doubts about swordsmanship. "Lady Kaya?" he asked. If Brando had heard Orthlus's voice earlier, he would have suddenly had a great hope that this woman came from the era of the War of the Holy Saints. In her era, the power of darkness and chaos was far stronger than in this era. Orthlis was no stranger to terms like the blood of God and tree herders. She even knew more about them than Brando. But Brando was a careful person and had already considered this point. In fact, on the way here, he had contacted Orthlis in his mind, hoping to get help from her. Unfortunately, the problem he faced was also a problem for Orthlis. Scarlet's life was already damaged, and it was the blood of God that repaired her body. In this situation, Orthlis told Brando that there were only two ways to solve the problem once and for all. The first was the miracle spell of the Holy Word. This spell could almost reverse the law, and it could even restore Medisha to the state before she was possessed by the blood of God. But then again, ever since the start of the War of the Holy Saints, apart from Saint Farnesane, there had never been a second person who could use this spell. The second method was even more ridiculous. The method Orthlis told him was to find the Covenant of Martha. The Covenant of Martha, as the name suggested, was a promise between mortals and Martha. Since the other party of the promise was the mother of all, Martha, then the number of wishes that could be fulfilled was almost limitless. This could be said to be an enhanced version of the miracle spell. If the miracle spell could save Scarlet, then it was self-evident. Unfortunately, the flaw of this method was that the possibility of it being realized was infinitely small. Although Orthlis told Brando that the Covenant of Martha did exist, Brando had never heard of it appearing in history or in the game. In the game, there were tens of millions of players exploring this world, and there were countless powerful beings. If even they could not find any clues about the Covenant of Martha, then how could he? However, even Orthlis could not come up with a better idea after rejecting both of them. But this time, the heroic spirit's voice gave Brando some hope. He knew that the ancient knight would not take the initiative to contact him unless it was an emergency. "I've taken a look," Orthlis said. "This girl should not be able to live for more than 12 hours. Her illness is beyond cure." She replied. 12 hours, just as Brando expected. But when he heard Orthlis' confirmation, his heart sank again. "Have you thought of a way?" the heroic spirit of the night asked. "There's no way to cure the root cause." Brando shook his head. "You mean you can cure her?" Orthlis was stunned when she heard his answer. Even if it was her, it would take a lot of effort to save this girl's life. And that was when she was in her best condition, and not in her current state. She could not do anything in her current state. When she saved Brando and Butchie, she had already done her best. The prime material plane was very harsh for a pure spiritual being like her. After all, it was not as free as in the sanctum, which was between fantasy and reality. Brando nodded. "There's a stupid way," he replied. "A stupid way." To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 339. Stupid Idea. When Seal closed the door and came in from outside, he happened to hear his feudal lord say such words out of the blue. Amandina and Medisha heard it as well. Even though they did not know why Brando was talking to himself, they understood what he meant. "My lord, are you saying that you have a way to save Scarlet?" Amandina was the first to ask. Medisha was a step slower than her. The silver elf girl turned to look at Scarlet, who was lying on the bed. She thought for a moment and decided not to say anything. Brando shook his head. "I don't have a good idea." He stopped talking to Orthlis in his mind and said to the others. Charles was obviously stunned for a moment. "My lord, what do you mean?" This young man, who usually didn't seem very reliable, was now a lot more serious. "The blood of God's tenacity is beyond your imagination. The Shire, you should know that it is not an ordinary thing. There are many ways to deal with it." Brendel looked at the red-haired girl who was lying quietly on the bed and paused for a moment. Not to mention that Scarlet had already died once. Reversing the cycle of life and death is a great taboo in this world. If not for the blood of God's shocking power, he didn't finish his sentence, but everyone understood what he meant even if he didn't say it out loud. So there's no other way. The Shire looked at Scarlet and asked. Seal her into a card. Amandina and Metasha were not surprised when they heard Brando's words. One of them had seen Brando's sealing card with her own eyes, and the other had experienced it herself. Brando continued, but the sealing card is not omnipotent. It can only keep the target in this state and turn them into a summoned creature. He paused for a moment. Let's not talk about the fact that this is unfair to those who have been sealed. The young man looked at Medusa, but the elven girl did not mind and immediately shook her head. My lord, this is Medusa's own choice. Then what about her? The Shire asked. My lord, you should ask her face to face, Metasha replied. I don't think she will refuse. My lord, you don't understand her heart. Brando fell silent. It was not that he did not see Scarlet's dependence on him, but he did not know why such a strong girl would be so weak. But the feeling of being trusted by someone makes me feel responsible. I promised her at the bottom of the Shaflund mine that I will not give up on her, and I cannot go back on my words. Moreover, it was not that he had no other way. He thought for a moment and shook his head, but I will not choose such a risky method until the last moment. Why? Amandina asked in confusion. Sealing a card of fate is not without risk, because it stores the sealed person's state on the card and turns them into a summoned creature. The Shire answered in place of Brando, so even if she is sealed as a card, there is a high chance that her consciousness will be replaced by the blood of gods. In the end, all our efforts will be in vain. Brendel had discussed this matter with him a long time ago, so he was the one who was most aware of it. But it's better than having no chance at all, isn't it? Amandina frowned. My lord, we can't just do nothing, right? Don't be impatient, Amandina. Brando looked at her and lectured. No one here said that we can't do anything, it's just that it's not the last moment. The last moment? Amandina calmed down. My lord, you mean there's still a chance? I said before, there's a stupid method. Stupid method. The transformation process of the blood of gods will always take over the body before devouring the soul. Brando looked at the red-haired girl on the bed and answered, so in the last moment, the possessed person will lose their strength. This is because the blood of gods has completely taken over the power of the body and the power of the blood of gods. The Shire and Metasha listened carefully and did not express any objections. One of them was a magus, while the other was a silver elf princess who was born in a time of war. They were already familiar with the mysterious knowledge passed down among the Magi. Amandina, on the other hand, was puzzled. Even though she was knowledgeable, it was limited to history, geography, nature, and some magical knowledge. She listened for a while and could not help but interrupt. What do you mean? Simply put, Scarlet's body has a part of the power. She was originally a warrior who was close to becoming a silver-ranked warrior. The blood of gods also contains a great amount of power, so after the blood of gods was implanted into her body, she was able to possess the strength of a gold-ranked warrior. But this is only the power that the blood of gods gave up in order to fuse with this body. It transferred a part of its power into this body, and this part of its power depends on the strength of the body itself. Then the blood of gods will go into hibernation, allowing the body to gradually adapt to the new power. Brando explained, in fact, this is the power that carries the aura of the blood of gods. Because all of this is done under the guidance of the original soul of the body, which is also done under Scarlet's guidance, her body will not reject this power. Brando continued, but Amandina was slightly puzzled and interrupted. What if Scarlet chose to reject this power in the first place? Impossible, she was already dead at that time. The Shire continued, moreover, under such a great power, most people would not have the chance to resist, and even if they succeeded, it would only be a matter of mutual destruction. Seeing Brando nod in agreement, Amandina suddenly felt a chill run down her spine. Although she had always heard of terrifying rumors about the tree herders and the unifying guild, but in her heart, these stories were just legends. In her eyes, these organizations were perhaps no different from the bandits and robbers outside the city. But until today, the Shire and Brando's descriptions gave her a more intuitive understanding of these two organizations for the first time. This is too much. Amandina frowned and was a little puzzled. Why would they do such a thing? Brando shrugged. There is no purpose. As far as I know, they are just going against all civilizations. He waved his hand. All right, back to the topic at hand. When Scarlet's body gradually accepts this power, the divine blood will awaken, and at this time, it will take back the power that originally belonged to Scarlet, and then Scarlet's. Finally, there is the power of life itself. Brando's voice lowered, but when the life is exhausted, the whole process is complete. Scarlet is now in this final stage. Amandina bit her lips. Then my lord, what is the stupid method you speak of? It is actually very simple, Brando replied. Since the whole process will only end when the power of life is exhausted, then the stupid method is to constantly replenish the potential of life that has been consumed. Amandina was slightly startled, and then her eyes lit up as if she saw hope. Then, my lord, how do we replenish it? The divine blood transforms power very quickly, and if this power is converted into actual consumption, I'm afraid that Scarlet would need to eat the entire output of Tonagel for a year to replenish this amount. The Shire did a little calculation, and then said a joke that was not so funny. How is that possible? Amandina was stunned. It is indeed impossible, but the other method is to use holy water, Brando replied, if we have enough holy water. We have some reserves of holy water, Amandina frowned. The holy water that she found from Grodden's personal stash was originally meant to be used in the next battle, but for the sake of her companions, she could only reluctantly give it up. How much do you need? We need at least 1,300 bottles of number 7 holy water. That much. Amandina was stunned. But the Shire's next words made her completely lose her strength. Every day. Then. Amandina finally understood the problem. After saying so much, doesn't it mean that there is no other way? This time, not only the Shire, even Medisha nodded. In fact, she knew from the start that this method would not work, but she did not know why Brando would bring it up at this time. This young lord didn't seem like someone who liked to talk nonsense. But just as the silver elf was puzzled, a weak cough came from the bed and immediately attracted everyone's attention. Everyone turned their heads and saw the red-haired girl lying on the bed slowly opening her eyes. Scarlet felt as if she had just woken up from a nightmare. Her body was drenched in sweat, and it took her a while to regain her senses. She then weakly turned her head and looked at Brando in a daze. Who is this? This young man's face is unfamiliar yet familiar. It's my lord. Scarlet blinked her eyes and finally remembered. This was the young man who told her softly that he would never leave her alone. She would never forget that answer, just like how she would never forget Makarov's answer. The same choice, but one was a lord who she had only known for a few months, and the other was a man who she had a relationship with for more than 10 years. He was both her father and teacher. Scarlet suddenly felt a little dazed. She laid on the bed without any strength in her body. It was as if there was a demon's shadow in her head that could drag her down into the dark abyss at any time. She was aware of her own condition, as if there had never been a moment clearer than this. She knew that she would soon return to Martha's embrace. It was as quiet as when she first came to this world. But Scarlet was not worried at all. She felt that it was about time, and she was tired. But she still held on subconsciously, holding on to the last bit of consciousness. She did not even know what she was holding on to. But when she saw Brando, she suddenly understood. The red-haired girl blinked her eyes weakly, and a drop of crystal-clear tear rolled out of her eye the moment she laid eyes on him. My lord. Scarlet struggled to shout, and her voice was almost inaudible. P.S. Try to start uploading the main character's attributes as soon as possible. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support legal reading. Chapter 340. Scarlet turned her head to the side and stared blankly at Brando's tears. The room was silent. Medisha did not speak, Falerne did not say a word, and the Shire only looked at Brando. Amandina looked left and right, and finally looked at her lord with suspicion. She did not experience the dark underworld of Shaflunt, nor did she have Medisha's keen insight. She naturally did not understand what Brando meant to Scarlet at this moment. But even a fool could see that she was attached to Brando, and she could not help but think the wrong way. Brando walked closer and stood beside Scarlet's bed. The girl finally stopped her weakness. She calmed down and forced a weak smile at Brendel with tears still hanging from her eyes. It was a sweet smile, but it was as fragile as if it was drawn on a pale, thin piece of paper that could shatter at any moment. "You're back, my lord." Scarlet opened her mouth. She had not eaten anything for several days and relied on drinking water to stay alive. She was so weak that she could barely make a sound. She only mouthed the words, "I'm back." Brando looked at Scarlet's condition and felt a little uncomfortable. "What about Shaflun's work?" Scarlet looked at him silently. Brando smiled and did not answer. "Did you come back to see me, my lord?" The doubt in her eyes expressed her question. Brando saw a glimmer of hope in her amber eyes. He nodded. Scarlet blinked her eyes hard. But she sniffed and lay back down. Her chest rose and fell slightly, and she frowned slightly as if she was in pain just lying there. No one dared to disturb her, and the room was so quiet that even a pin drop could be heard. "Can I live?" The red-haired girl turned her head to the other side and stared blankly at the lush branches of the mangrove tree outside the window as she asked softly. Brando hesitated for a moment and nodded. "The truth. When have I ever lied to anyone?" Brando replied. Scarlet was stunned for a moment. "But I think Sir is lying to me." The red-haired girl spoke in a soft, feminine voice. Her coquettish tone made everyone's heart soften. No one would have thought that this stubborn girl would be so weak. It was as if the pain of the past few days had completely disintegrated the strength that she had been supporting for so long. Brando did not answer. In fact, no one had the ability to answer this question. The room was silent. Actually, Scarlet looked at the dark green leaves on the branches of the mangrove. The sunlight seemed to print its veins clearly. "I heard your conversation." She took a deep breath and said, "It's impractical. Forget it. Even I don't think it's necessary." The girl smiled. If Makarov was here, he would have realized that he had never paid attention to his adopted daughter's smile. It was as sweet as an angel's. "Chien." Amandina interrupted her and took a step forward angrily. "What are you talking about?" The usually quiet girl did not continue. Scarlet's words made her uncomfortable. But Brando waved his hand at her. He looked at Scarlet and made a decision in his heart. The young lord raised his head slightly and asked softly, "Do you have any other wishes, Scarlet?" Everyone was stunned. Even Scarlet was slightly stunned. Even though she said such stubborn words, she did not want to leave in her heart. Otherwise, she would not have gritted her teeth and persevered. Even though every day was like hell, she still waited for the young lord to return. Because he told her that he would bring her with him. No matter what, he would not leave her behind. It was these words that touched her heart. She looked at Brando in a daze. She felt so bad that she wanted to cry. Everyone lied to her like this. They lied to her like this. They told her that she could do it, but in the end, the answer she received was that she could not do it. It was the same in the past, and it was the same in the present. Scarlet wondered if she was being too greedy, always asking for things that others couldn't do. She had clearly given her sincere feelings, but in return, she felt as if her heart had been stabbed with a knife. The red-haired girl looked at him, tears welling up in her eyes. Finally, she sniffed hard and whispered with great difficulty, "My lord." Scarlet paused. She took a breath to adjust her emotions. She tried to speak 3 times, but the last time, she choked out, "In my hometown, there is a tradition. It is said that when a person dies, their closest relatives will kiss their forehead to leave their thoughts there. Even if they go to another world, they will not forget them." She looked at Brendel helplessly. She could not bring herself to hate him, this hateful liar, and thought to herself, "My lord," she said. "So, can you be Scarlet's closest, one time? Even if once is good enough." Scarlet gasped for air. She used all her strength to lie back down. She muttered to herself in a daze, "Leader, Eek, Yura, and everyone, don't want Scarlet anymore." Amandina heard this and turned her head away. She sniffed hard as if she did not want to see what would happen next. But Medisha and the Shire's eyes fell on Brando. Brando was silent for a moment. Then, he nodded. After Scarlet lost her last bit of support, she completely collapsed. She did not see Brando nod. But in her daze, she still wanted to laugh, but she did not even have the strength to laugh. What a failure! She could not help but think that her life was a failure. She wanted to protect others, but she was unable to do so. She wanted to rely on others, but in the end, she was abandoned. She was so sad that she wanted to cry. But she could not cry. "Close your eyes, Scarlet," Brando said softly. The girl was stunned for a moment, then she became quiet. She thought that at least Lady Martha saw her small existence in the end. She obediently closed her eyes. But this was her last wish. She did not want to leave behind any regrets. She closed her eyes and seemed to hear the sound of the wind blowing in the mountains of Chablis. She grew up listening to this sound. This was the homeland of the mountain people, the place where all her dreams began and ended. Scarlet suddenly felt a sense of peace in her heart. She thought that she had finally returned to this place. In this quiet forest, she had grown up with everyone. Every single one of them was so clear. Eek, leader, and the carefree time had returned to her side. But she still raised her head slightly and stubbornly waited for the kiss that contained another piece of memory. It was a signal to bid farewell. But she waited for a long time. It was as if the world did not move, and time had stopped. But it did not come. Scarlet wanted to open her eyes, but she did not know if she had the strength to do so. But at this moment, she heard a gentle voice, "Don't move." The red-haired girl closed her eyes and trembled slightly. Her face and ears turned red. "Is it coming?" she thought. But at this moment, she felt something cold touch her lips. Scarlet let out a low cry from the depths of her heart. If she could, she would definitely feel her ears, no, the roots of her ears, burning. How could he kiss there? There are so many people in the house. The red-haired girl felt that she was going to die, but not from the blood of God. She was going to die from embarrassment. Scarlet froze for a moment. She did not know what to do. Her brain seemed to have turned to stone. Her heart was thumping in her chest. That sound had never been so strong and clear. But wait. Scarlet's bashful movement stopped. She tried to take a breath. Strong and clear. It had been a long time since she could think so clearly. All the pain had stopped, and she felt as if her vitality had returned to her body. The feeling of powerlessness that made it difficult for her to even breathe had disappeared without a trace. She could clearly feel a warm current entering her body from her mouth. It slid down her small tongue into her throat, and then spread to her limbs and bones. This power seemed to be able to heal her pain and pull her out of the abyss of suffering. Scarlet was stunned. She subconsciously reached out to touch her face, although she had not opened her eyes. But this inner surprise only lasted for a moment, and then it was replaced by another kind of embarrassment. No matter what, that guy can't kiss me. How could he do that? Scarlet's face turned red again, like a lovely red apple, and in front of so many people. And he even put some strange things in her mouth. The red-haired girl felt that she could not think about it anymore. She lowered her head slightly, feeling as if her body was burning. She wanted to find a hole to hide in immediately. She closed her eyes tightly. She would rather die than open them. Otherwise, she would be laughed at to death. But at this moment, she heard a burst of laughter. This laughter was like the last straw that broke the bowstring, causing Scarlet to open her eyes. The first thing she saw was Amandina and Falern's faces, but they had to hold back their laughter. Everyone except for the Shire and Medisha. The young wizard and the silver elf princess were looking at the thing in Brando's hand with incomparable shock. It was a golden apple. Brando expressionlessly placed the apple on Scarlet's lips. To be honest, his mood was different from the others. He was not happy at all because the powerful vitality in the golden apple could only prolong Scarlet's life, but it could not change the final outcome. On the other hand, it could strengthen the divine blood in her body. Brando could only comfort himself. The legend said that the golden apple could change a person's fate, and he could only hope that it could change Scarlet's fate. This was a last resort, and the little female dragon had clearly told him that there was something strange in the apple. He thought that even though it was not poison, it could not be anything good. But at this moment, Scarlet's face was burning. Even Brando looked at the girl with a strange expression. He thought that a person's face could be so red. Could this be the little female dragon's prank? But he did not think that Scarlet's only thought at this moment was to find a piece of cheese and kill herself. She did not think that she had made a mistake, and this was not the most embarrassing thing. The most embarrassing thing was that her reaction was clearly seen by Amandina and Falern. I'm going to die. Scarlet thought, and she had long forgotten about the divine blood in her body. Speaking of which, there hasn't been much support recently. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 341. Scarlet was saved. It was like a miracle. The lively atmosphere in the room only calmed down after a long time. Before this, no one thought that Brando would have a way to save Scarlet from such a dangerous situation. However, the facts proved that this young and mysterious lord was omnipotent. Amandina was certain of this conclusion after thinking about it countless times. She retracted her gaze from the young man in a daze and felt like she was relieved. But when she saw Scarlet holding the golden apple in her hands and smiling weakly at her after noticing her gaze, she couldn't help but sigh in her heart. This silly girl. Amandina shook her head. She knew that Scarlet was going to sell herself to help Brando count the money. When the Shire told everyone that the golden apple was the legendary golden apple, she wasn't the only one who was shocked. Scarlet was even more stunned, as if she was struck by lightning. The golden apple almost fell from her hands and rolled to the ground. If it wasn't for Medisha's quick reaction, it would probably be the first golden apple in history to be broken. But when she saw Scarlet hugging the golden apple in a daze as if she was hugging the most precious treasure in the world, Amandina knew that this girl was completely hopeless. Amandina sighed. Just like Medisha, the intelligent Amandina could see that Scarlet was unusually reliant on others. This girl who looked strong seemed to always live for others' opinions. But she understood that Scarlet's sorrow was that in this world, she could only rely on herself. Under most circumstances, the eyes of others would rarely linger on others. Not to mention nobles like Makarov. Their footsteps would never stop for even a moment unless it was for their own benefits. Scarlet's efforts were destined to be unrequited. If she could see this clearly like the other members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries, perhaps she would feel better. But she was still Scarlet, a weak and strong girl. Amandina glanced at Brendel again and thought to herself that she was lucky to have such an oddball like him as her follower. Magnanimous, benevolent, and full of humanity, Brando's actions seemed to be out of tune with the world of nobles. But to say that this young man was not a noble, Amandina herself could not convince herself. Other than nobles, she had never seen a person as knowledgeable and magnanimous as Brando. Everything seemed to indicate that this young man was not only a noble, but also had an extraordinary family background. This was proven by the old swordsman, Coden, who was captured from the mines. After Brando left Castle Abes, Amandina was the first person in charge of Castle Abes. She was well aware of his identity, or rather, she knew every single one of Count Randner's most outstanding knight subordinates. For the sake of Brando's plan, she had been doing her homework. Coden was born in a knight's family and had participated in the November War. He had been by Count Randner's side for a long time. All of these nobles knew about him. But when he spoke, he unintentionally revealed his attitude towards Brando, which aroused her suspicions. Without a doubt, the old swordsman knew Brando. He knew Brando's elders, and from their conversation, Amandina could tell that Brando's elders were not simple people. Of course, this information might be scattered and not valuable in the eyes of a normal person. But when it fell into the ears of this intelligent girl, it was enough to confirm the information she knew about Brando, and formed a complete picture. Brando's identity seemed to be becoming clearer. This young man came from a noble family that had a long history, but was not well known. He was such a rare descendant of a noble. Amandina could not help but wonder if she was blessed by the heavens. Was that why she was able to meet the current lord in Bragg's dark room? She was taken in by him, followed him, and became his aide. At least until now, she had never regretted it. She only felt that she was extremely lucky. But when she looked at the golden apple in Scarlet's hand, she still felt a little envious. After all, it was the golden apple. Legend had it that it could change the fate of a person, or even a country. It only existed in myths. Before this, she did not even believe that this legend was real. She could not help but think that if this young man had such a golden apple, he could use it to bribe the most powerful forces, right? It was a priceless treasure. With it, Brendel would be able to gain the favor of anyone with authority. Whether it was a count, a marquis, or even a duke, it was not a problem at all. Even the supreme emperor of the Cruz Empire, or even the grand priest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, if this young man wanted, he could use this golden apple to exchange for almost anything he wanted. But Amandina did not understand. Brando did not. He only used this golden apple to save a girl he had only known for a few months. Perhaps Scarlet had the strength of a gold-ranked fighter, but Amandina understood that the value of a golden apple was not as simple as a gold-ranked fighter. Of course, if the other side of the equation was multiplied by 100 times, it was possible. Of course, the answer to this question was simpler for Brando. He simply understood that a man's wealth was his own ruin. Perhaps this noble girl thought that he had a huge family behind him that could shelter him from the wind and rain, but Brando knew what kind of situation he was in. Moreover, he did not intend to have any dealings with Erewhon's rotten nobles. He was here to change the fate of this ancient country, not to be in cahoots with them. Brando knew that he could live comfortably in this world with his foresight, but that was not his goal. Especially after seeing Makarov and Grodin's performance, his confidence grew day by day. As for the golden apple, Brando did not care. If it could be cured, he did not mind using 10 or 100 golden apples to save Scarlet's life. Of course, that was if he had it. But Amandina did not see it that way. Scarlet also did not see it that way. The person in question was holding the golden apple in a daze. She knew the value of the golden apple. When Brando was negotiating with Makarov and the others, she saw Fleetwood, Makarov, and Buga's desire for the golden apple. She could not help but wonder who was more important to Makarov, her or the golden apple. She did not need to think about the answer to this question. Even if there were 100 of her, Makarov would not hesitate to choose the golden apple. But why did that young man make a completely different choice? Scarlet did not understand, and she looked at Brando in confusion. She saw that he was talking to Medisha and the Shire, and did not have any intention of turning around. "My lord," Medisha was the first to voice her doubts, "I think I understand what you mean. Using the golden apple's power to restore Scarlet's life force. But," she frowned, "this is like drinking poison to quench one's thirst." She used a phrase unique to the Silver Elves to express the meaning of drinking poison to quench one's thirst, but at least Brando understood. "My lord, there is no other way." The Shire explained, "It's better to delay it for as long as possible. It's better than facing it immediately. Who knows, we might be able to find some other way in the meantime." The young Magus chuckled as he looked at Scarlet, who was sitting on the bed. He couldn't help but tease her, but using the golden apple to do such a thing will probably make those who desire the golden apple half die from anger. This is... The young wizard thought for a while before he found the right word. "It's a little overkill." Scarlet heard the Shire's words and lowered her head subconsciously. When she regained her senses, she felt that it was a little wasteful. She had the golden apple in her hands, and it was used on her. It was unbelievable. Scarlet felt that she had never thought of such a thing even in her wildest dreams. But when the Shire saw the girl's reaction, he realized that he had misspoken. He quickly said, "Miss Scarlet, don't think too much. I didn't mean to say that it's a waste. It's just that the golden apple is priceless, I think." The young wizard thought for a while and laughed. "I suddenly remembered what my lord said last time. It's a very apt description of the current situation." Everyone turned to look at him. Seal quickly shrugged. "All right, I'm saying that if this golden apple is a reward, Miss Scarlet, you'll probably have to marry me in order to pay off this debt." The young wizard squire giggled. "Marry me?" Scarlet was stunned. "That's what it means." "You know what I mean," the Shire said as he took a step back, trying to dodge Brando's sword. But as a wizard, it was obviously impossible for him to dodge the attack of a swordsman of the same level at such a close distance. As soon as he finished his sentence, he screamed and fell to the ground, clutching his stomach. Brando was angry at him for blurting out such a big mouth, so he didn't hold back. He wanted the guy to lie on the ground for a few minutes before he could get up. The silver elf Medisha looked at the Shire who was rolling on the ground and showed a rare "you deserve it" look. Scarlet finally understood the Shire's words. She held the golden apple and lowered her head, her face red all the way to her neck. Brando looked at her and said, "Don't pay attention to what this guy said. But if you really want to repay my investment in the golden apple, you have to live well. Remember what I said. You are my most important fighter." He took a deep breath. "I think Tonajul will soon face a great battle." Scarlet was stunned and lowered her head, not daring to raise it. She just nodded. Brando wanted to say something, but he felt Medisha tugging at his sleeve. He turned around and saw the silver elf princess frowning and asking, "What's the matter?" My lord, if the golden apple can only solve the problem temporarily, then have you thought of a better way? The young man was stunned and was about to shake his head when he heard Orthlus's voice in his mind. I have an idea, little one. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 342. Orthlus's method was simple. Since the blood of gods was invading and devouring the original soul, it was a battle on the spiritual level. One of the methods was to destroy the blood of gods, but since that was not possible, there was another way to think about it. The knight's suggestion was to find a way to strengthen Scarlet's soul. When it came to strengthening a person's soul, there was no one better than wizards and elementalists in this aspect. Orthlus told Brando that she had thought of this method because she remembered another special use of the golden apple. The golden apple was also known as the language of the fairies, and was the most precious gift to wizards and elementalists. However, it was not easy to use this method to strengthen one's soul. After all, for a native like Scarlet, leveling up was not something that could be done as long as Brendel gained experience. It was a long and arduous process. But for Scarlet, even with the help of the golden apple, she could only delay it for 1 or 2 years. Orthlus's suggestion was to let Scarlet and the blood of God fight for the power of the golden apple, but this was also very difficult. First of all, the speed of absorption was different. Unless Scarlet reached the level of an elemental awakener or an elementalist within 2 years, this suggestion was not very realistic. But to reach the level of an elementalist within 2 years, Brando thought about it and shook his head. But no matter what, it was better to have a way than to have no way. Although it was difficult to promote a person to the level of an elementalist, it was not impossible. At least, Brando knew that there were some harsh methods to achieve it. But now, he could only try his best. Of course, he did not tell anyone about this and buried it in his heart. In the end, Brando gently closed the door. Medisha, Falerne, and the Shire followed him out of the house. Although Scarlet had temporarily recovered, her body was still very weak. It was not suitable for her to be disturbed too much. Brendel only arranged for Amandina to accompany her. Of course, he did not wake up the Roman who was sleeping soundly. It was not that he did not want to, but it was Amandina's idea. Then let her sleep a little longer, Brando thought. In fact, he also felt a little sorry for the little Roman. Back in Schaflund, this self-proclaimed merchant girl's workload was even heavier than his, and after returning here, she accompanied Scarlet for a day and a night. Brando rubbed his throbbing temples. Even though it was temporary, the golden apple had finally solved one of his worries. He just didn't know what kind of seasoning the little female dragon had added to the apple, so he couldn't tell for the time being. My lord. The Shire called from behind. The young squire still had one hand on his abdomen and was bending over with a grimace, but his face was now a little more serious. Brando glanced at him, then turned around and walked forward. Speak, he replied. The number of people coming from Palace has clearly increased. Where? Abes? Brando asked. No, this is the information from the Red Copper Dragon and the others. Mente. The Shire nodded. Oh. Brando was a little surprised. This was the first time he had received news from the Red Copper Dragon and the others after so many days. Although the young man had arranged for the Amber Sword to take advantage of the situation and attack Menta's old lair, even he himself wasn't sure if the Red Copper Dragon and the others would actually listen to him. Once a person had power, they would become arrogant. Perhaps Retta wouldn't, but it was hard to say for the people around him. He slowly revealed an interested expression and asked the Shire to report the information from the other side. From the young magus, the young man learned the whole story. After Menta sent out his troops, the person in charge of the castle was his eldest son. In order to prevent his son from killing his other brothers while he was away, Menta didn't leave many troops in the castle. However, this created a perfect opportunity for Reto and the others. They took advantage of the night to launch a sneak attack. As for the enemies, they didn't expect them to be so daring and ended up as captives. After taking control of the castle, the red copper dragon did the same thing as Brando. He used Menta's eldest son as a puppet and had him gather all of Menta's retainers, manor owners, nobles, and even the monks of the Menta area. Then, he took them down in one fell swoop during the so-called banquet. After that, Leto immediately ordered his men to spread out in the Maxon area, leading the refugees from Fortress Reden to eliminate a few bandit groups and forcefully take control of the area. Of course, the whole process wasn't as smooth as it was described. However, Reto, Mano, Badam, Uriel, and the former captain of the White Main Army, Terran, played a decisive role. If it wasn't for them, the refugees from Fortress Reden would have been nothing more than a bunch of refugees. Much to Brando's surprise, when the Amber Sword first sent out their troops, there were some differences. However, Uriel, Badam, and Terran were firmly on his side. Terran was a silent and obedient soldier. Brando didn't find it strange that he made this decision. As for Badam following him in brags, it was also understandable. However, why would this captain from Fortress Reden side with him? Why would he side with him like this? Of course, as mentioned before, Brando had a good habit. If he couldn't figure it out, he would temporarily stop thinking about it to avoid a headache. All in all, this was excellent news for him. Uncle Reto, you did well. Brando wasn't stingy with his praise. In his heart, he approved of the other party's actions. He originally hoped that the Amber Sword mercenary group would be able to take over Lord Maxon's Mint's castle, but he didn't expect Copper Dragon to give him such a surprise. From the information he received, Reto and the others had already taken over half of Maxon's territory. Although this meant that Lord Maxon's governance wasn't good enough, the results were still beyond his expectations. This was very important. Maxon, Schaflund, and Baron Abi's territory were the gateway to the Paulus region. If they could control Maxon, it would be equivalent to controlling the future battlefield. You mean, Brando asked again, someone from the mercenary group is coming? The Shire nodded. Who is it? The young squire once again showed a playful expression and smiled. Why don't you take a guess, my lord? Guess? Brando tilted his head 45 degrees and glanced at his squire from the corner of his eyes. The Shire saw that Brando's right index finger, middle finger, and thumb were already on Halran Gaia's hilt and cried out in fear, No, no, my lord, I mean, it's better if I tell you. In fact, there was no need for him to say anything. Brando brought the three of them down the spiral staircase to the hall on the first floor and saw the person waiting there. The former captain of Fortress Reden's cavalry. The young man was slightly startled. He originally thought that it would be Badam, because that boorish mercenary group leader had been with him for the longest time and understood him the most. In fact, Gasol was also startled when he saw Brando. He hadn't seen Brando for almost half a year, and now this young man brought the Shire, Metasha, and the wild elf girl out from the shadows of the hall. His temperament and appearance were completely different from the young man he saw in Fortress Reden. At first glance, Gasol didn't dare to go up and greet him. After half a year of adventuring, trekking in the wilderness, and tempering in blood and fire, Brando no longer had the shyness and childishness of a young man. This young lord slightly pursed his lips, which symbolized the resoluteness and determination in his heart. His eyes were sharp, as if they could pierce through a person's heart with a single glance. The young man was wearing a black robe. The fabric was slightly gray, but it didn't reduce his temperament at all. The aura was as sharp as an unsheathed sword. Brando held the hilt of his sword with one hand and sized up Gasol. That casual glance made Gasol's hair stand on end. He had only seen such an aura from Tiger Luke Besson. Cold, resolute, this was an aura that came from the battlefield. My lord. The former captain of the security cavalry hesitated for a moment, then left his seat and stood up subconsciously. At that moment, he was secretly surprised. Not only did Brando's aura change, but there was also an even more minute detail that made his heart skip a beat. Gasol was very clear about Brando's original strength. The strongest he could be was no higher than a silver, or even a silver. Of course, even though the strength of an iron rank was commendable for such a young man, it was still acceptable. But now, the young man standing in front of Gasol gave him an even bigger shock. He could no longer sense his opponent's strength. Or to put it more accurately, it was bottomless. Gasol was originally only an iron rank, but after half a year of adventuring, whether it was his swordsmanship or absolute strength, he had made great progress. His strength was now firmly at the peak of iron rank, and he could vaguely feel the boundary of silver. His improvement could be said to be the fastest among everyone, second only to Terran. Originally, he wasn't a match for Reto, but now he could fight him to a draw. But even so, he found that he could no longer see through Brando's strength. The young man's hand was placed on the hilt of his sword, and his aura naturally formed a hole. This was the sign of great swordsmanship, master rank. The former captain of the security cavalry couldn't believe his eyes. He thought that his improvement was fast enough, but he didn't think that Brando's improvement was even faster than his, and even exceeded his imagination. In just half a year, the young man had surpassed him by 2 ranks or even more. Even a genius wouldn't be able to do this. Gasol was dumbfounded. Above 2 ranks, wasn't that the strength of an intermediate silver rank? He couldn't imagine this speed. Brando nodded at him. I didn't think it would be you who came, the young man said frankly, you've worked hard. My lord, Gasol sincerely lowered his head this time. Brando had led them out of Fortress Reden, and at that time he had established his prestige in everyone's hearts. Everyone remembered the high-spirited figure who led them to charge into the undead army. But as time passed, some people started to forget the initial gratitude. When Brando asked them to attack Maxon's territory, this order caused a huge uproar in the mercenary group. Many people disagreed with this order. Attacking a legitimate noble was a bit outrageous and audacious. But it was him, Terran, and Badam who stood up to support this order. He didn't know what Terran and Badam were thinking, but he had his own ideas. Him, Gasol. Katos was once the captain of the security cavalry in Fortress Reden. With the support of the nobles behind him, he could do whatever he wanted in that small place. Other than the White Mane Army and the nobles, everyone had to respectfully call him Captain Gasol. But Gaspard was no fool. He knew that behind this respect was fear and even hatred. But at that time, he didn't care. In his eyes, the world was one-sided and one-sided. Only those with power and authority could rise above others. Until Brando led them to defeat the dark undead of Madara, who were much stronger than the nobles in Fortress Reden, and even made them tremble in fear. Only then did he realize that there was a power in this world that could make people's blood boil. It was a power that could make people devote themselves wholeheartedly to it. Young people call it an ideal. Reto told him that it was faith. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 343. The Will to Live. When he decided to join the Amber Sword, he hesitated, but in the end, he made his decision. In fact, when he was adventuring with the Red Copper Dragon, the leader of the cavalry was also hesitant. He had to lead so many refugees through several areas, and sometimes even had to fight with bandits on the main road. Life was much more difficult than when he was in Fortress Reden. He did not know why he did it. All he knew was that the people he knew in the past, the refugees from Fortress Reden, the people who hated him in the past, now spoke to him with a kind of respect. The way they addressed him did not change, it was still the same captain. But some things were different. Uriel found that he could no longer abandon everything he had now, or rather, return to the days of the past. It was as if something called a sense of responsibility had been born in his heart. This was the reason why he supported Brando. It was very simple. Captain Uriel told himself that he did not support this young lord, but the person who changed him. He felt that if a person with such charisma could change and influence a person like him, then he must have the ability to lead them to the end. That was why he did not hesitate to stand on the side of Badam and Terran. Uriel lowered his head, many thoughts running through his mind at that moment. But what really troubled him was Brando's strange order. He thought for a moment, and finally could not help but raise his head with a bitter smile. "My lord, Brando did not think any less than Uriel, but the young man thought further. He walked past Uriel and turned around. "What is it?" "My lord," Uriel replied helplessly, "you said that you would inherit a piece of land, but you did not tell us that you would inherit it like this." Although the former captain of the cavalry stood on Brando's side, he did not completely approve of Brando's actions. He was familiar with the rules of the noble's game, and naturally knew that Brando's actions were against the world. Brando was taken aback. He hadn't expected Gaspard to be thinking about this. This question made the corner of his mouth twitch. He couldn't possibly say that this was an impromptu idea, could he? Fortunately, Amandina wasn't here, or else he would have been embarrassed by the resentful gaze of the noble lady who had been complaining about his decision. The young man smiled awkwardly. "Originally, I was going to inherit the territory, but there was an unexpected situation. Grodin has caused me a lot of trouble, but it's not a big deal. We'll get what belongs to us in the end." Brando started to change the topic. "But what about Count Randner? I don't think he'll let this matter rest." Gaspard glanced at the young lord and asked worriedly. "That's why I wanted to see you before," Brando replied. "Did Uncle Redo ask you to bring the news over, Gaspard?" The words Uncle Redo made Gaspard heave a sigh of relief. All signs showed that Brando was a sentimental person. In fact, Brando did not send any of his trusted subordinates to min the castle for the past half a month. Instead, he allowed the copper dragon Redo to take charge of the castle. This showed that Brando had full trust in them. Of course, this was a slight misunderstanding of Brando's intentions. Brando did not think about this at all. Schaflund was so busy that he didn't even think about what Redo and the others would do. Occupying Tonajol was a chess piece to prepare for the future war. In fact, Brando did not think much about it. The nobles in Tonajol were so poor that they were just short of pawning their pants. Brando did not even bother to think about taking over these places. But he did not plan to do anything about it. Instead, he allowed the Copper Dragons group to enjoy the thrill of being a lord, and those who originally doubted his decision gradually calmed down. Of course, there were still some voices that were worried about Count Randner's revenge. But to these fugitives, it did not matter whether Count Randner retaliated or not. At worst, they could just hide in the forest. "Yes, my lord." Gaspard nodded. Brando bent his finger and knocked on the long table. His brows were tightly knitted together. "My lord." Gaspard was surprised. "It's earlier than I thought." "The war has come." Brando replied. "What?" "The historical Lord Paulus is a wise and prudent man. He will not be unaware of the news of his comrade's defeat. This is enough to make him slow down his plans and become more cautious." The historical Lord Paulus. the Copper Knight repeated with a serious expression. Brando glared at him, and the young wizard quickly shrank back. He was already used to his lord's strange way of speaking. But this knight did not withdraw his hands and feet. Instead, his movements became more frequent. This means that he has received Count Randner's orders. This is a sign of war. The former captain of the knights gasped in surprise. A sign of war. He knew that Count Randner would definitely seek revenge, but he did not expect it to come so quickly. He was not even mentally prepared for it. My lord. The silver elf princess asked softly from behind. Brando shook his head, indicating that there was no need to be too worried. What should we do? Gaspard was a little worried. The highest level of nobles he had come into contact with in the past were the gentry in Fortress Reden's local council. He could only look up to those who were of a higher level. Count Randner's status was not inferior to the Duke of Grenoir's. Gaspard could not imagine that he would be able to crush him like an ant. He could not help but look at Brando in surprise. Why was the young man talking about something that had nothing to do with him? It was as if he did not offend a powerful count, but a country bumpkin. Are you afraid? Brando asked. Not at all. Gaspard quickly shook his head. Of course, this was a lie. How could he not be afraid? There is no need for that, Brando shook his head. If we can defeat Lord Maxon, we can also defeat Count Randner. Enemies are to be valued, not to be feared. Gaspard nodded. The wild elf princess who was hugging her notebook thought for a moment and asked softly, Is there going to be a war again? How much time do we have to prepare? Brando looked at the sky outside the hall and replied, 1 month, at most 2 months. But Lord Paulus will not let us have a good time in the next 2 months. Our priority is to prepare. Medisha and the Shire fell silent. They knew that the upcoming war would be the greatest test for their new territory. As long as they could win this war, they would be able to gain the recognition of the royal faction. And as long as they gained the recognition of the royal faction, the people in the territory would be able to stabilize. Otherwise, no matter how hard they tried, they would be like rootless duckweeds. In this ancient kingdom, or even in this era of wound, status and righteousness were very important things. The people at the bottom might think well of you, but they might not necessarily stand on your side. Brando knew this very well. However, it might not be that easy to win this battle with almost no support. He had 1 to 2,000 human soldiers and 3,000 subterranean dwellers, but Tajiv would not put the fate of the entire tribe in his hands. In other words, the subterranean dwellers were already giving him a lot of face by investing half of their forces in this war. What could they do with this little force? Brando thought for a moment. He did not know how much manpower Count Randner was going to invest in quelling the rebellion, but it should not be too little. Lord Maxon's fate was a warning. Even though 1 or 2 defeats would not be enough to hurt Count Randner, it might not be the case in this particular situation. Duke Arek and the princess were constantly pressuring the old fox, and he was already exhausted from dealing with them. If a fire broke out in his backyard, he would be in deep trouble. At the very least, his reputation would be ruined. But it would not be too much. Brando did not want Count Randner to lose face, and the princess and Duke Arek would not give him the time to do so. He thought for a long time, and in the end, he still felt that the old fox would rely on external forces. He thought for a moment and turned back to ask, Where's Madara? They're quite well behaved, Charles replied. They seem to have left Trendheim. Be careful of those skeletons. I suspect that they have been colluding with Count Randner for a long time. Brando shook his head. Madara was obviously interested in Sifrid, and Insursta would not give up so easily. If Count Randner had an agreement with them, he would definitely use it to get them to work together. He sighed again. Insursta should be thanking him. If he hadn't helped Enrich to get rid of Cabius, there would probably be more undead in the army trying to show off their qualifications. Brando was well aware of this history, and naturally knew that the greatest trouble the Enrich dragon had encountered in the army was the resistance from the Dark Lords. If it wasn't for Tarkus supporting him, the young Dark Lord might really have had a hard time achieving anything in this war. However, the young man immediately withdrew these unrealistic thoughts. If he could, of course, he would be willing to wait until the enemy could win. Unfortunately, the enemy would not give him this opportunity. Brando asked the Shire about the people who were sent to investigate Erwin's Southern Legion. Unfortunately, the answer he received was disappointing. The Shire had told him that the men he had sent out had either disappeared without a trace, or had returned with useless information. As such, Brando's plan to support the Southern Legion to restrain Madara and focus on dealing with Lord Paulus was temporarily put on hold. P.S. That's fast. I've already written another 100 scenes in this volume. Please give me some support. You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.